In the spring of 1966, in a quiet neighborhood in the Bronx, New York, an elderly woman named Elsie Litt was found murdered in her apartment. The discovery was made by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen Elsie for a couple of days. Normally, Elsie was a creature of habit. She would be out for her morning walk or tending to the small flower box on her windowsill. Her absence was noticeable, and it felt wrong. When police entered her apartment, they found a scene that was both tragic and puzzling. Elsie was in her bedroom. The official cause of death was determined to be a combination of strangulation and multiple stab wounds. The investigators on the scene noted these specific details with professional detachment. The ligature used for the strangulation appeared to be a torn piece of a dirty bedsheet twisted tightly around her neck. She had also been stabbed repeatedly with what the coroner later identified as a thin, sharp blade, something like a stiletto or a paring knife. On her bedside table, a cup of what looked like hot chocolate sat undisturbed, now cold. The apartment showed some signs of a minor struggle, but there was no forced entry. This suggested that Elsie had likely known her killer, or at least had willingly let them into her home. The police began their investigation, starting with the people who knew Elsie. But the thing was, Elsie Litt lived a very quiet life. She was a widow, her children were grown and lived in other states, and her social circle was small, mostly consisting of a few other elderly neighbors in her building. Detectives interviewed everyone they could, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. They canvassed the neighborhood looking for witnesses, but came up empty. They processed the crime scene for fingerprints and any other forensic evidence, but in 1966, the technology was limited. The killer had been careful, leaving behind very little. The case quickly grew cold. For 9 long months, the murder of Elsie Litt remained unsolved, a troubling file in a cabinet at the local precinct. The city moved on, and for most people, the quiet old woman who was violently killed in her own home became a forgotten statistic. But for a few, the memory lingered. Fast forward 9 months to the evening of the 12th of December, 1966. A four-year-old man named Jose Lorente stood outside an apartment door, also in the Bronx, not too far from where Elsie Litt had lived. Jose was a tailor by day, a meticulous man who worked with thread and fabric. But by night, he had a different trade. He held a large, heavy bag in his hand as he knocked on the door. After a moment, the door opened, just a tiny crack. A woman's wary eyes peered out at him. She recognized him, saw the bag he was carrying, and then opened the door just enough for him to slip inside. As soon as he was in, she quickly shut the door and slid the bolt lock into place with a heavy thud. The woman was clearly on edge. She led Jose through a small hallway and into the living room. Sitting on the couch, under the dim light of a single lamp, was her son, a 4-year-old man named Ivan Barbosa. Ivan looked terrible. He had dark circles under his eyes, his posture was slumped, and he had the haunted, vacant stare of a person who hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. And according to the story his mother had told Jose over the phone, that was exactly the problem. You see, Jose Lorente's second job was far more unique than his first. He was a self-proclaimed psychic medium. He specialized in conducting spiritual cleansings for people who believed they were being haunted. People like Ivan. It was Ivan's mother who had called him, desperate for help. She said her son was being tormented by the ghost of an old woman. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and he was becoming a shell of his former self. They had heard about Jose through a friend of a friend, someone who said Jose had a gift for dealing with these kinds of things. But here's the secret. Jose did not actually believe in ghosts. Not at all. He was a firm skeptic. He knew that the elaborate rituals and cleansings he performed were not supernatural. He saw them as a form of psychological therapy. In his experience, when people believed they were being haunted, it was usually a manifestation of something much more mundane, like severe stress or grief or profound loneliness. His ceremonies, with all their candles and incense and incantations, were essentially a powerful placebo. He would act the part, convincingly, and by doing so, he gave his clients the permission they needed to believe the problem was gone. And surprisingly often, it worked. They would feel better, the haunting would cease, and life would go back to normal. So, while Jose knew he was technically deceiving people, he felt the ends justified the means. He was helping people who felt they had nowhere else to turn. So on this night, Jose sat down in a chair across from Ivan and his mother. He looked at Ivan with a calm, reassuring expression and did what he always did. He asked him to tell him about the haunting. Ivan was visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he clasped them in his lap. He started to speak, his voice a low stammer at first. He explained that for months, every single night, the ghost of an old woman would appear in his room. He didn't know who she was, just that she was old and she would stand in the corner just staring at him. But recently, it had gotten worse. He said her expression was changing. Every night, she seemed to get angrier and angrier. Her silent stare had become a terrifying glare. Ivan was now so petrified that he couldn't even bring himself to go into his own bedroom at night. He was convinced this spirit meant to do him harm. He was living in a constant state of fear. Jose nodded along, listening patiently, showing deep sympathy on his face. Inwardly, he was thinking this sounded like a classic case of sleep deprivation psychosis mixed with anxiety. But he knew what mattered was that Ivan believed it was real. That was the problem he was here to fix. When Ivan finished his story, his voice trembling, Jose leaned forward slightly. He told Ivan that he understood his fear, but that he knew exactly how to help. He explained his plan. They were going to conduct a séance. The goal was to make contact with this spirit, to communicate with her, and to ask her to leave Ivan alone and find peace. Ivan looked incredibly doubtful, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and skepticism. But his mother put a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and Jose spoke with such confidence, telling them he had performed this ceremony many times and it almost always worked. Ivan, desperate for any kind of relief, finally, reluctantly, agreed. He just nodded his head slowly. Okay, let's do it. With that, Jose reached down and opened the large bag he had brought with him. He began to take out his supplies, the tools of his trade. He worked methodically, creating a specific atmosphere in the room. First, he took out several large black sheets of fabric. He carefully draped them over the television set and a small radio in the corner. This, he explained, was to symbolically shut out the noise and distractions of the outside world to create a sacred space. Next, he arranged a dozen small white candles in a large circle on the living room floor. In the very center of this circle was a low coffee table. On the table, he placed a very old, leather-bound Bible. Next to it, he set a small brass dish for incense. Once everything was in place, he went around the room and lit each candle one by one, filling the room with a soft, flickering glow. Then he lit the stick of incense, and a thin ribbon of sweet-smelling smoke began to curl up towards the ceiling. The room now felt completely different, hushed and solemn. As a final touch, Jose went to the windows and drew the blinds, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the dancing candlelight. He then asked Ivan and his mother to come and sit with him on the floor, inside the circle of candles near the coffee table. They did as he asked, settling onto the carpet. The three of them now sat in a small triangle, the air thick with anticipation. Jose began the ceremony. He picked up the old Bible from the table, opened it to a random page, and read a short prayer in a low, sonorous voice. It was a prayer for peace and protection. When he finished, he closed the book and placed it back on the table. Then he looked at Ivan, then at his mother, and told them to hold hands. Jose reached out and took Ivan's right hand and his mother's left, completing the circle. Now, he said softly, I want you both to close your eyes. Do not open them until I tell you to. They complied. The only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the candle wicks and their own breathing. And then, Jose did what he always did at this point in his seances. He spoke into the silence, his voice calm and clear. If there are any spirits in this room, he called out, we ask you to give us a sign of your presence. We mean you no harm. We are here to listen. Now, this was the part where Jose usually had to get a little creative. Typically, he would just wait. He'd listen for any random noise in the building. The groan of pipes, the floorboards settling, a gust of wind rattling the window pane. Any small sound could be interpreted as a sign from the spirit world. It was all about presentation. And if the building was too quiet, if no natural sound occurred after a minute or so, Jose had a backup plan. He would subtly tap his own foot on the floor, just hard enough for the others to hear it. Then he would say, "Did you hear that?" The spirit is making contact. It was simple but effective. So there they sat, in the dark, holding hands, eyes closed. Jose was listening, waiting for a sound he could use. A full minute passed in total silence. Nothing. He was just about to go for the foot tap trick. But then, something happened. Something that had never, ever happened to him before. An intense, jolting sensation shot through his entire body, like he had been struck by a bolt of electricity. His muscles went completely rigid. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His vision instantly went black, as if a switch had been flipped off in his brain. And then, a series of bright, chaotic images began flashing through his mind. They came and went so fast it was a dizzying, confusing storm of pictures. He saw a cup of hot chocolate rattling on a small table. He saw a stained, torn piece of a bedsheet being twisted by a pair of dirty, grimy hands. He saw a single, wide-open eye staring in terror. A screaming mouth. Then a flash of red, then a glint of silver, then red again. The images cycled over and over, faster and faster, a terrifying, nonsensical loop. Suddenly, Jose felt his own mouth open. He wanted to scream for help, to tell them something was terribly wrong, but he had no control. Instead of his own voice, a sound came out that was completely alien. It was a high-pitched, raspy shriek. It was a voice that sounded old and full of rage, and it seemed to be coming through him, not from him. It was speaking, forming what might have been words, but the rhythm was strange, and the sound was so grating he couldn't make sense of it. The images were still flashing in his mind, everything was happening at once, and it was pure chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The voice coming from his throat cut off. His mind went completely blank. His body, which had been rigid as a board, went totally limp. He slumped forward and slowly, very slowly, came back to himself. He found himself lying on the floor, his head on the carpet, feeling completely disoriented and weak. For a moment, he had no idea where he was or what had just happened. Then, his eyes focused. He saw the circle of candles, the incense smoke still lingering in the air. He remembered. He was in the apartment. He was doing a seance. But something had gone horribly wrong. His body ached all over, and his throat felt raw and scraped, like he'd been screaming for hours. What on earth just happened? As Jose slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, trying to make sense of it all, his first rational thought was that he must have had some kind of seizure. A stroke, maybe. Whatever it was a medical emergency, and he probably needed to get to a hospital. But as he looked around the dimly lit room, taking in his surroundings, he noticed three things that were very, very wrong. First, the front door of the apartment, which the mother had so carefully bolted shut, was now standing wide open, letting in the faint light from the hallway. Second, Ivan's mother was cowering in the corner of the room, staring at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She was looking at him as if he were a monster. And third, her son Ivan was gone. Jose's head was spinning, but he managed to speak. His voice was hoarse. He asked Ivan's mom, "What happened? Where's Ivan?" The story she told him in a panicked, trembling voice completely contradicted everything Jose thought he believed about the world, about science, and about ghosts. According to her, in the middle of the seance, Jose's body had suddenly gone stiff. His eyes had rolled back in his head until only the whites were showing. Then he had straightened up, his posture unnaturally rigid, and he had turned his head and looked directly at Ivan, even though his eyes were closed. And then he began to speak. But it wasn't his voice. She said it was a shrill, raspy voice, the voice of an old woman, filled with an unearthly rage. She was convinced it was the ghost that had been haunting her son, that it had taken possession of Jose's body. And this ghost, speaking through Jose, had said something to Ivan. Something so terrifying that Ivan had let out a scream, scrambled to his feet, and sprinted out of the apartment without a second's hesitation. Now, Jose was listening to this, and his rational mind was screaming that this was impossible. He was thinking, this woman was already convinced her son was being haunted. She's just interpreting what happened through that lens. I had a seizure, and it scared her and her son. That's all. There are no such things as ghosts. He tried to tell himself that over and over. But a small part of him, a part that remembered the electric shock, the blackness, the horrifying images, couldn't fully dismiss it. He couldn't explain what had happened to him. But regardless of what had actually occurred, he felt a wave of guilt. Whatever his medical episode looked like, it had clearly terrified Ivan, a young man who was already in a very fragile mental state. And now, he had run off into the night. At this point, Jose just wanted to leave. The whole situation had spiraled completely out of his control. He no longer wanted to pretend to be a psychic. He just wanted to go home. He stood up on shaky legs, began gathering his candles and his Bible, and stuffing them back into his bag. He apologized profusely to Ivan's mother, who was pleading with him to stay to explain what had happened. But Jose just shook his head. "I can't," he said. "I have to go. I'm sure Ivan will be back soon. I'm sorry." And with that, he walked out of the open door, leaving the terrified woman alone in her candlelit living room, and he went home. In the days that followed, Jose tried to put the incident out of his mind. He assumed Ivan had just gotten spooked and would eventually return home once he calmed down. He thought the family was dealing with a mental health crisis, not a supernatural one. He figured Ivan would be fine. But Ivan didn't come back home. After a few days of frantic waiting, his mother called the police and reported him missing. The police launched a search, and eventually, they found him. Ivan Barbosa was in a cheap hotel room in a neighboring town. He was dead. He had died from a single self-inflicted gunshot wound. When the police looked at the scene, it seemed like a straightforward, open-and-shut case. A troubled young man had taken his own life. That was the end of the story. But when they delivered the news to Ivan's mother, she was adamant that they were wrong. There was more to it, she insisted. And she told them over and over that they needed to talk to the psychic medium, Jose Lorente. She explained that right before her son ran away and ended his life, they had held a seance. And during that seance, Jose had said something to Ivan, something that sent him fleeing in terror. She was convinced that whatever Jose had said was the direct cause of her son's death. The police were, of course, extremely skeptical. A psychic medium? A seance? A ghost? It sounded like nonsense. They were busy people, and this sounded like the ramblings of a grieving, delusional mother. But she was persistent. She called the station every day, telling the same story, begging them to just go and talk to this man, Jose. Finally, just to appease her, 2 detectives agreed to pay him a visit. When they found Jose at his tailor shop, he was clearly shaken to hear that Ivan was dead. The detectives asked him about the seance, and Jose was surprisingly candid. He told them he didn't actually believe in ghosts, and that he thought he had suffered some kind of medical episode, maybe a seizure. He told them he had no memory of speaking during the event. "I don't remember saying anything," he explained. "All I remember is when I blacked out, I was seeing these weird visions in my head." The detectives, mostly just going through the motions, asked him, "What kind of visions?" Jose paused, trying to recall the chaotic images. He said they were jumbled and confusing, but a few of them stood out very clearly in his memory. "I saw a torn bedsheet," he said, "and there were dirty hands twisting it. I saw something silver, like a thin sliver of metal, like a knife. And I saw a cup of hot chocolate, and it was rattling on a table." He said it all felt like a bizarre dream and that he was sure it was just his brain misfiring during the seizure. He didn't think any of it was important. He just felt terrible that his medical problem had scared Ivan so badly. But as he was saying this, he noticed the two detectives were looking at each other. Their casual, slightly bored expressions had vanished. They were now looking at him with intense focus. One of them pulled out a notepad and said, "Sir, could you please tell us again exactly what you saw in your vision?" Jose, confused by their sudden interest, repeated the details again. The torn, dirty bedsheet. The silver knife. The rattling cup of hot chocolate. The detectives were stunned into silence. Because it turned out, those details were not random. They were the highly specific, non-public details from the 9-month-old unsolved murder case of an elderly woman named Elsie Litt. She had been strangled with a dirty, torn bedsheet. She had been stabbed with a thin, silver knife. And there had been a cup of hot chocolate on her bedside table when her body was found. These were details only the killer and the police knew. There was absolutely no way Jose Lorente, a simple tailor, should have known any of this. The police suddenly had a shocking new theory. What if Ivan wasn't being haunted by a random ghost? What if he was being haunted by the ghost of the woman he had murdered? And what did the ghost, speaking through Jose, say to him that night? The detectives went back to Ivan's mother and asked her that exact question. What were the exact words spoken during the seance? She looked at them, her eyes filled with a new kind of dread, and she told them. She said that when Jose had gone into his trance, he had looked right at her son and shrieked in that horrible old woman's voice, "You killed me, and you're going to die the same way." For Ivan, this must have been the ultimate confirmation of his worst fears. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being judged. The ghost of his victim had found him, and she was promising him a similar fate. The guilt and terror that had been manifesting as a haunting had finally culminated in a direct, terrifying accusation from the spirit world itself. He ran, not just from the apartment, but from the truth he could no longer escape. The police, armed with this incredible story, reopened the Elsie Litt murder investigation. They began to dig into Ivan Barbosa's life, looking for any connection, however small, to the murdered woman. They discovered that Ivan lived only a few blocks away from Elsie's apartment. He could have known her, at least by sight. While they never found a concrete motive, the theory they pieced together was that Ivan had likely broken into her apartment to rob her, things went wrong, and he ended up killing her. For 9 months, he got away with it. But his guilt ate away at him, twisting itself into the terrifying nightly visions of his victim. He wasn't being haunted by a ghost, he was being haunted by his own conscience. The seance was supposed to be his salvation, a way to banish the ghost. Instead, it became his final judgment. Faced with what he believed was a direct accusation from beyond the grave, he couldn't live with the guilt any longer and took his own life. Based on the chillingly accurate details provided by Jose Lorente during his unexplained trance, the police officially closed the murder case of Elsie Litt. They named Ivan Barbosa as her killer. As for Jose, he was never the same. He was a man of logic and reason, a skeptic to his core. But he had experienced something that night that he could never logically explain. He had no memory of speaking Elsie Litt's judgment, but the evidence was undeniable. He had, it seemed, become a genuine conduit for the spirit world. The experience terrified him so much that he immediately gave up his work as a psychic medium and never conducted another seance again. Tonight's stories remind us that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not those hidden in the dark, but those concealed within the human mind. Whether it is guilt, fear, coincidence, or something much more inexplicable, each of these cases leaves behind questions that haunt people for decades afterward. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, an 18-year-old college student named Michael Perry found himself 1,000 feet underground inside one of America's most dangerous cave systems. He was crouched low inside a vast, dark cavern in Lafayette, Georgia, surrounded by 4 of his friends. As Michael shifted his weight, the beam from his headlamp danced across the cave walls, catching slick rock formations dripping with moisture. The light briefly illuminated underground waterfalls cascading through the darkness before vanishing into deep black crevices that seemed to have no bottom. The entire place felt alien, cold, and completely cut off from the sunny world above. And before that day was over, 2 people inside that cave would be dead. The cave they were exploring was called Ellison Cave. Michael and his friends had driven more than 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville, Florida, just to see it. Ellison was famous among experienced cavers. It was a sprawling underground maze filled with narrow tunnels, massive vertical drops, freezing waterfalls, and pitch-black chambers that could turn deadly in an instant if something went wrong. Every year, adventurers from all over the country traveled there looking for excitement. But, to be perfectly clear, this kind of activity, caving, it was not really Michael's thing. Not at all. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida. If you asked him to describe himself, he would have said he was a pretty quiet person. He enjoyed studying, he liked playing in his school's band, and he dedicated a lot of his time to volunteering with his church youth group. So the idea of crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, intensely claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet beneath the Earth's surface, that did not rank high on his list of fun things to do. In fact, it probably wasn't on the list at all. But Michael wasn't in Ellison Cave that day for fun. He was there for a very specific reason, and that reason was his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach. Grant had been the one to suggest the trip. He was passionate about it, and when Grant got an idea in his head, he was very persuasive. So Michael, being a good friend, had simply said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Just then, Michael glanced over to where Grant was sitting. He was with his girlfriend, a young woman named Carrie, and their 2 other friends were there as well. The group of them were huddled together, looking through a large backpack. They were taking inventory, checking over the various pieces of specialized gear they had brought along with them for the expedition. They had only entered Ellison Cave a few minutes ago, but they had already stopped. The group had paused their progress because there was something in this specific area of the cave that Grant was absolutely determined to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it almost always happened. That was just the kind of person he was. It's why Michael, despite his reservations, had capitulated and ended up deep inside this mountain. Grant wanted him to come, and so, like he normally did, Michael went along with it. Grant was a natural leader. He was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a group that Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also devoted members of. When Michael had first joined the fellowship, Grant had immediately taken him under his wing. He saw something in Michael. He told him that he had tons of potential. In fact, Grant had said that Michael had enough potential to one day become the next president of the fellowship himself. Hearing this from Grant had been a huge deal for Michael. It gave him a massive boost of confidence because he really truly looked up to Grant. And he wasn't alone in that. A lot of people did. Grant was just one of those effortlessly cool guys. He was a few years older than Michael, stood about 6 feet tall, and was basically a walking, talking ball of positive energy. He was always on the lookout for the next adventure, the next challenge to conquer. Caving was one of those adventures. Grant had been exploring caves as a serious hobby for the past 3 years, and out of everyone in their group that day, he was the only one with any real practical caving experience. And it was precisely because of this lack of experience among the others, Michael included, that Grant had chosen an easier route for them. They were navigating a tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain. It was a beginner's trail. It didn't require much in the way of technical gear, like ropes or complex climbing equipment. But despite the low level of difficulty for their chosen path, they had brought all of that extra equipment anyway. They had ropes and harnesses and carabiners. They had it all. And that was because along this easier route, right at the spot where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a massive vertical shaft. And Grant specifically wanted to climb down into it, even if he had to go alone. This particular shaft was 125 feet deep. To put that in perspective, imagine a 10-story building. That's how far this pit dropped straight down into the earth. But in the world of serious caving, this was actually considered a small one. It was officially called the warm-up pit because compared to the other, much deeper pits inside Ellison Cave, it was nothing. Some of the other vertical drops in the cave were way, way deeper, some over 500 feet. So while this was definitely not a beginner's task, for an experienced caver like Grant, it was a manageable, almost routine challenge. Michael watched as Grant picked up the backpack, the one with all the equipment inside, and carried it over to the entrance of the pit. The entrance was just a very large, dark hole in the cave floor. It was situated over near a noisy waterfall, and it was only a few feet away from where Michael was standing. So Michael walked over to Grant to offer his help. He wanted to assist him in setting up the gear for his descent. The process involved attaching a long climbing rope securely to the rocks around the pit's edge, creating an anchor that Grant could then use to lower himself safely into the darkness below. This whole setup process is called rigging. It took them a while to get it all done. Michael, again, had no experience with any of this, so he had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every single step. He would hold a rope here, check a knot there, all under Grant's careful direction. But as Michael worked alongside his friend, he found himself peering down into that pitch-black hole. As he looked down into what felt like a bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach do a little flip. He was suddenly very, very glad that he had not promised Grant he would go down into the pit with him. Because seeing it now, up close and in person, it was terrifying. He wanted no part of going down into that thing. But Grant clearly did. His eyes were bright with excitement. He was in his element. So Michael and Grant continued the process of getting Grant all set up. And then, eventually, when Grant was fully rigged and ready to go, Michael heard a strange sound. It was the sound of something heavy sliding off a rock. And then, just moments later, that sound was followed by a loud, echoing thud that seemed to come from deep, deep inside the hole, from the bottom of the warm-up pit. For a brief moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what he had just heard. Maybe it was just a loose rock that had tumbled into the pit. But then he looked over at Grant. Grant had a very unhappy expression on his face, and he was staring at the ground right next to the edge of the pit. He was looking at the spot where their backpack had been sitting just a second ago. The backpack with all of their extra equipment inside? At least, the equipment they weren't currently using. And the backpack was no longer there. It was gone. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet straight down into the pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. The last thing they wanted was for their backpack to be at the bottom of that hole. But it was actually much worse than just potentially losing some of their equipment. Because inside of that bag was the only cell phone they had brought with them into the cave. And it was also where they had stored all of their extra ropes and other essential climbing gear. They had taken some things out, of course, to get Grant rigged up for his descent, but losing that bag felt really, really bad. Without the contents of that backpack, they could easily get stranded or trapped deep inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anyone for help. They would be completely stuck. And so Michael could feel a wave of panic starting to wash over him. But then Grant cut in. He played it cool, as he always did. He just looked at the group and said, "Look, it's no big deal." He would just go down there and get it. I mean, he was already planning on going into the hole anyway, and he was all rigged up and ready to go after all. So he would simply go down, retrieve the bag, and come back up. It would be fine. And then, before Michael or Grant's girlfriend, Carrie, or any of the other friends could say a word, Grant just strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders. Ascenders are climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled, measured way. he began positioning himself at the edge of the pit, preparing to go down. Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident, so in control, that he was able to make everyone else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt his own panic starting to subside just from watching Grant's unshakable demeanor. This wasn't the first time Grant had projected such calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year of college, he had casually climbed up the entire exterior of one of their school's tallest dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did. He had also joined the school's ROTC program, which is a military reserve training program, and as part of that, he had learned how to jump out of airplanes. So he had skydived, another one of his thrill-seeking activities. This moment here in the cave seemed like yet another perfect example of why Grant was such an incredible and natural leader. And as Michael watched him, he found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, he could be just as fearless, just as composed as Grant. But for now, Michael just watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole. And then he disappeared into the abyss below. For the next few minutes, it was very quiet in the cavern. All Michael could hear was the constant rushing sound of the nearby waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just talked quietly amongst themselves. They waited for Grant to call back up to let them know that he had made it to the bottom and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant's voice. He did call out from somewhere deep down in that hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying. The waterfall that was blasting away nearby was really loud, and it created a lot of noise. And on top of that, Grant's voice echoed strangely around the stone walls of the cave, which made it almost impossible to tell what he was trying to say. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others, they weren't worried yet. They just figured this was an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of the pit, and he leaned over carefully, trying to look down. But it was no use. He couldn't see Grant. He was too far down, and it was far too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself, explaining that they couldn't understand what he was saying from up there. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael's call. But Michael still couldn't really make out the words. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he didn't know what Grant was saying, one thing was suddenly definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really, really fast. He was repeating himself. He was saying something over and over again very, very quickly with a sense of extreme urgency. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what the words were, the tone was unmistakable. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems can and do arise when you're rappelling into a 125-foot hole deep underground inside a cave. That can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they finally processed that something was seriously wrong for Grant, it was truly shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that gets other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing ever rattled him. And so to hear him basically panicking, it was deeply unsettling for those of them standing at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden dual realization. One, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way. But worse, two, is the fact that they are not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they completely lacked the experience, but also because all the caving gear, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that had fallen into the pit. It was down there with Grant. So there was no way they could realistically help him if he was in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one and only cell phone was down there in that backpack in the pit as well. And so, unless Grant could somehow figure out whatever problem he was having and get himself back up to the surface on his own, Michael and the others knew, without even having to say it out loud, that they were completely and utterly helpless. And so, as this grim realization is setting in for Michael and the other friends, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds panicked, to straight up screaming. He is screaming for them. Something is horribly, horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying desperately to get him to clarify what's going on. But you have this powerful waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing water everywhere. It's dark. And Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them anymore. And so it's just chaos. It's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends that are with them. And they tell them, look, we're going to stay right here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two need to leave the cave right now. Go get help. And so the other two friends, they rushed off to do just that, disappearing back into the darkness of the tunnel. While Michael and Carrie just sat there by the edge of the pit, listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere far down in that black hole, they still had no idea what was wrong. But clearly, there was a major emergency happening. And so, for a little while after their friends had gone off to find help, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really having a conversation with Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming and they still can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole. They're yelling things like, everything's going to be okay. We've sent for help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They had no idea if he could even hear them or understand what they were saying. They were just assuming that the acoustics were just as bad for him down there as they were for them up here. Again, the sound of that waterfall was so incredibly loud. It was so dark. And so they're just having this awful, helpless moment. But then something cut through all of that chaos. At some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. It was like he was directly yelling to Michael a clear and desperate plea. I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously, the situation has escalated dramatically. Things were already bad, but for Michael, this felt like a huge deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously terrible, but Michael, he kind of views himself as Grant's potential successor. He's going to be the next president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was this fearless, capable leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his own name called out so clearly that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him. You, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility in that instant. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait for help to arrive. Something needs to be done right now, and I need to be the one to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up and he grabbed the extra harness they still had with them and he started to put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. What are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, who is still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over to the edge of the pit and he attached his harness to the very same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to somewhere down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason. And into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared down into that hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit. She put her hands together and she prayed as hard as she possibly could for both Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying. He called out that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie. And as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in her body, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her system because now she's thinking everything is okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it before. She had been so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also of Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt and the cave was very damp and there's this waterfall constantly spraying a mist of cold water everywhere. It was a cold, damp environment. And so her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine. I'm fine. But he didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell that clearly there is something really wrong down there, and it probably has something to do with Grant. And so she stood up. She began pacing back and forth anxiously, her stomach is in knots. And she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just repeat that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, occasionally yell out, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. But the responses just began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more, what's going on? Until finally, Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so, the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around the edge of the pit, yelling out to Michael and Grant. But the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cold cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into Ellison Cave, carrying a large bag filled with climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of professional rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them. That team had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving much more slowly. It takes time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there are a lot of people and a lot of specialized equipment that is required. And also, usually, the victims are trapped in pretty remote and difficult to access places, like deep tunnels and narrow shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his 2-man team were the initial smaller group that went in ahead of the larger one, just to kind of get the rescue started as quickly as possible. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around erratically. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman. She was sitting by a large hole in the ground, and she was shaking and absolutely terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole. She told him that Grant had gone in first, there had been some kind of issue, and then Michael had gone in after him to help. And now, when she called out for them, neither one of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her safely out of the cave. And then, once they had left, Anmar put on his own climbing gear. And as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into the pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft. And at first, he can't see anything at all. But after a little while, he began to see, somewhere far down below, what appeared to be 2 small lights towards the bottom of the pit, which he correctly assumed belonged to the 2 missing men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash against his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness, right below him. It would turn out, when Grant had rappelled down into the warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rigging, his main rope, to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful and you move quickly. Except what happened with Grant is, as he was rappelling literally through the flowing water, like the water is coming off this waterfall and it's hitting him directly, he got stuck. His rope got tangled, and the spot where he got stuck was literally in the direct path of the waterfall. So, he's stuck in the cave. he can't go up. He can't go down. And he's just getting pounded by a constant stream of freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around trying desperately to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this narrow vertical shaft. There's nowhere to move, and he's just dangling there. And he began trying to scream out for help. But that was why his words were so muffled. The water was hitting him in the face, making it impossible for him to speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there very, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have sent his body into shock. It's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or even think anymore. He was rapidly becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. He said it really clearly. He must have managed to get his face out of the direct path of the water for just a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely, when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his personal calling. He felt he needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so, into the hole he went. And he hooked his own rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had used. And down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached the spot where Grant was, but he got stuck as well. Also, in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was. Like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie at least for a little while. But he also got tangled at the same spot. He couldn't move. His body was getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two young men had frozen to death. They had basically dangled inside of that hole, getting hit by that freezing water for about 2 hours before their bodies just completely shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his own life in an attempt to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his remote Washington State lodge. He had a glass of whiskey and Coke in his hand, and he turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. Just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume on the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore. A couple of his cats were fighting in the other room, yowling and hissing, and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had living with him, but it was a lot. Maybe a dozen or so. And even though at this particular moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him. He liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's beloved wife Edna had died. And ever since then, he had lived completely alone, minus all of these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors to speak of either. So, for the most part, he had been fairly isolated for the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the beautiful lake that his lodge was situated on, was a 4-hour drive south of the major city of Seattle. It was pretty far out there, deep in the wilderness. The lake did get busy during the summer months with tourists and campers, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there year-round, and they were all very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, of course, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and he had the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and the lake right outside his door. And he had his whiskey and cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff, cantankerous guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's front door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lived way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not normally expect visitors. But in this case, he knew exactly who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a deep scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really only had one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. For the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door right now, had been harassing him. They were trying to get him to leave his lodge, to abandon the home in the wilderness that he loved so much. They said they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation, and they wanted everybody in the area to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country. He had even fought for it during the First World War. But he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law completely and made his own booze. He just didn't care about their rules. So, over these last few days, as these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated in the slightest. He had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in the hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, and certainly not with local police. Not with his own family, not with his friends, and not with the 2 ex-wives he'd been with before he found Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum, always. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were. And not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy, a man that Harry did know. He was clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try one more time to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door, even after the deputy had clearly announced himself knowing that Harry would recognize his voice, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him, "You've got to leave." The deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision for himself. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad. Because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years. And 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little bit after she had died. So truthfully, it was kind of falling apart, and it smelled terrible because of all the cats. But it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete and total understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this whole area, was his religion. And he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever else told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside his door was a very firm good night, which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild for him. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his police cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself. He picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground. And at the same time, he was sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, the officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house. He had his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a fresh glass of whiskey sitting in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house that he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreen trees, but it also had a great view of the mountains and the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods all around him were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also down near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and had left when they were told to. Which meant that Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, the officials had not physically attempted to force him out of his home, but now that Harry saw them all assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities. And that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's stubborn refusal to leave his wilderness home, just because the government told him to, had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on, and they had started coming all the way out to his house to talk to him. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always just looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really, really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by all these outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to have any chance of staying in his home. Because the way he saw it was, the government could not really make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So, over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single, older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful than himself, which was sort of admirable. Although people didn't really understand why he was doing it, it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house. He famously said, "No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right this is my home. They're going to have to come and get me. No authority could take me out of here. No authority dare." And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he bottled and distilled himself during his prohibition days, which he called panthropy, and about his relationship with his late wife Edna and how they used to dance together right at the edge of the lake. Or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so, by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this was 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry Truman, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail. Reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest with himself, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been perfectly happy with his quiet life. He had no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it was like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong, and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. The sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, At 8:32 in the morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights as a citizen. They were trying to save his life. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, the land that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated and urgent warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing hot lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and all of his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So, in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loved so much. And in both of today's stories, the people at the center of them made choices they believed were the right ones. Grant believed he could handle the cave. Michael believed he could save his friend. Harry believed the mountain he loved would never harm him. But sometimes, confidence, loyalty, and even love can push people toward decisions they never fully realize are dangerous until it's far too late. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know which story stayed with you the most in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about strange disasters, impossible decisions, and people who found themselves in situations far beyond their control, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, see ya. Some stories you hear seem to sit right on the edge of what we understand. They feel like they could be true, they have all the pieces of a real event, but there's always one detail, one piece of the puzzle that just doesn't fit into our world. Tonight, we're going to look at 3 such stories. They are separated by time and distance, but they all share that one chilling detail that pushes them from the ordinary into something else entirely. We begin on a quiet farm in rural Ohio in the summer of 1921. A young man named Carl Logis stood on the porch of his new farmhouse, looking out at the land he now owned. It was a warm evening, and the crickets were chirping their endless song. He took a deep breath of the country air. This was it. This was everything he had ever worked for. Carl was not a complicated man. He had a simple dream, one that he'd held on to since he was a boy, to own his own piece of land, to work it with his own 2 hands, and to live a quiet, self-sufficient life. And now, against all odds, he had it. The farm was modest, with a small house, a sturdy barn, and a reliable water well. The fields stretched out into the darkness, promising a future of hard work and honest reward. He'd even managed to buy it for a surprisingly low price. The family who sold it to him had been in a huge hurry to leave. They didn't say much about why, just that they were ready for a change, ready for the city. Carl didn't ask too many questions. A good deal was a good deal, and he saw it as his good fortune. He stepped off the porch, a lantern in one hand, its yellow light cutting a small circle in the deep darkness of the night. He had a pistol holstered on his hip, more out of habit than any real sense of danger. It was time for his final check of the animals before turning in for the night. His horses and cattle were his livelihood, and he took their care seriously. As he walked across the yard, the crunch of his boots on the dry soil was the only sound besides the crickets. He looked back at his little farmhouse, its windows dark, and then ahead towards the large, dark shape of the barn. He felt a swell of pride. This was all his. He was alone out here, master of his own small world. And then, the feeling came. It was sudden and sharp. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind that makes you feel like you've been caught doing something you shouldn't. He felt with absolute certainty that he was being watched. He stopped dead in his tracks. But that was impossible. He lived completely alone. His nearest neighbor was miles away. There were no roads nearby that people would be walking on this late at night. It was just him, his land, and his animals. Instinctively, he whipped around, raising the lantern high. The light swung wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to jump and flee. He scanned the open fields, the line of trees in the distance, the area around the farmhouse. Nothing. Just the empty, dark landscape. He listened intently, holding his breath. He heard nothing but the wind rustling through the tall grass. His practical mind immediately started searching for a rational explanation. A predator, maybe? A coyote or a fox? He looked around again. The night was peaceful. The crickets hadn't stopped their chirping, which they usually did if a large predator was near. And the previous owners hadn't mentioned any problems with dangerous animals in the area. He shook his head, a small, frustrated sigh escaping his lips. He was just being paranoid. That had to be it. He was new to this property, new to living so isolated. Every little sound, every shadow was magnified by the darkness and the silence. He told himself to calm down, that he was just letting his imagination get the better of him. "Go check your animals and go to bed," he muttered to himself. "Everything is fine." He turned and continued his walk to the barn, his pace a little quicker than before. He slid open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar smells of hay and livestock filled the air, and the gentle sounds of the animals shifting in their stalls were comforting. He set about his work, topping off their water, checking their feed, making sure everything was secure for the night. He busied himself for a few minutes, his mind focused on the simple, repetitive tasks. For a little while, he managed to forget about that strange, unsettling feeling he'd had outside. He was finishing up, giving one of his horses a final pat on the neck when the feeling returned. This time, it was even stronger. It was an intense, piercing feeling, as if a pair of eyes were boring right into his back. He stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned to look out the open barn door. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. He scanned the dark corners of the barn itself, the hayloft above. Nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. He was not alone. He tried to tell himself again that it was just his nerves, but deep down, a cold knot of fear was tightening in his stomach. The walk back to the farmhouse, which a few minutes ago had been a source of pride, now seemed like a long and treacherous journey through enemy territory. But he couldn't stay in the barn all night. He took a deep breath to steel his resolve. He picked up his lantern, and his other hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip, his fingers resting on the worn leather of the holster. He stepped out of the barn and began walking quickly towards the house, his head on a swivel, scanning the darkness on either side of him. He was about halfway across the yard when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was on the far side of his property, out in the distance. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his lantern, aiming the beam in that direction. The light was weak at that distance, but it was enough. He could clearly see a figure. Someone was standing on his land. They were just standing there, perfectly still, a tall, pale silhouette against the dark fields. It looked almost white in the dim light. For a second, Carl was too shocked to move. He just stood there, holding the lantern, staring at this silent intruder. The figure was standing near his water well. Finally, his shock gave way to anger. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the quiet of the night. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to flinch. It just stood there, seemingly staring right back at him. Then, slowly, it turned and began to move. It wasn't walking or running. It was more like it was gliding, moving away from Carl and towards the water well. That's when Carl's fear and anger boiled over. This was a trespasser. This must have been who was watching him earlier. Were they trying to rob him? Scope out his property? He wasn't going to let them get away. He drew his gun from its holster and started running towards the figure, shouting for them to stop. As he ran, the lantern in his other hand swung back and forth, making the light unsteady. The white figure seemed to flicker in and out of view between the bouncing shadows. He was closing the distance, but the figure was moving with an unnatural speed. He lost sight of it for a moment behind a small rise in the ground. By the time he reached the water well, panting and out of breath, the person was gone. They had just vanished. He stood there, scanning the area in every direction. There was nowhere for them to have gone so quickly. The fields were wide open. There were no trees or buildings to hide behind. It was as if they had just dissolved into the night air. Carl didn't know what to think. Was this person playing games with him? Had they circled back around to his house while he was chasing them? The uncertainty was terrifying. All he could think to do was yell out into the darkness. He warned them that he had a gun and he wasn't afraid to use it. He told them to get off his property and never come back. But his threats were met with nothing but silence. The crickets had stopped chirping now. The night was eerily still. For a long time, Carl just stood there by the well, his gun still in his hand, his eyes straining to see any sign of movement in the darkness. But the figure never reappeared. Eventually, the cold night air began to seep into his bones. He knew he couldn't stand out here all night. With one last paranoid look around, he turned and ran the rest of the way to his farmhouse. He burst through the door, slammed it shut, and slid the bolt home. The next morning, with the sun streaming through his windows, the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. Carl tried to rationalize it. It must have been a local prankster, or maybe a neighbor who was too shy to introduce themselves properly. Or perhaps it was a would-be thief who got scared off when Carl shouted and drew his gun. Whatever it was, he told himself it was a one-time thing. He had stood his ground, and they wouldn't be back. He desperately wanted to believe that. But he was wrong. That night, and almost every single night for the next year, the same thing happened. Around 9:30 p.m., just as Carl would be heading out to the barn for his final check, he would see the figure. It was always there, standing at a distance, a pale shape watching him from the edge of his property. It never got any closer, and he could never make out any features. It was just a silent, ever-present observer. Every night, Carl would scream at it, curse at it, tell it to leave. He would run towards it, his gun in his hand. One night, in a fit of rage and desperation, he even fired a shot in its direction. But every single time, the outcome was the same. The figure would turn, glide silently towards the water well, and then, right around that area, it would simply vanish. As the months wore on, Carl's initial anger and fear slowly turned into a kind of weary resignation. He wanted to believe it was just a persistent trespasser, someone with a strange obsession who was impossibly good at hiding. But he knew deep down that wasn't the case. Though he was not a superstitious man, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The way it moved, the way it disappeared into thin air, it had to be a ghost. What else could it be? And then he would remember the family who sold him the farm, how eager they were to leave, how they practically gave the place away. He started to think that maybe their hurry to get out had something to do with his nightly visitor. But as terrifying as it was to live with a ghost on his property, Carl clung to one fact. It was predictable. It appeared at the same time, in the same area, and it never did anything more than just watch. It never came near the house, never bothered his animals. It was a frightening, but ultimately harmless, part of his new normal. He learned to live with it. That is, until the 1st of August 1922, almost exactly 1 year to the day after he had bought the farm. On that day, something changed. Carl went out to water his horses and cattle just as he did every day. But this time, they wouldn't drink. They shied away from the troughs, snorting and stamping their feet nervously. They acted as if the water was poisoned. Carl was baffled. It was the same water from the same well they had been drinking for a year without any issue. He cupped his hands and tasted it himself. It tasted fine to him, clean and fresh. But the animals were adamant. Something was wrong with the water. He realized the only way to solve the problem was to clean out the well. He would have to drain all the existing water, scrub the inside, and let it refill with fresh, clean groundwater. So, Carl went over to the well, the very spot where the ghostly figure disappeared every night. He set up the pump and began the long, laborious process of draining it. As the water level slowly dropped, he peered down into the dark opening. He saw something. There was something large at the bottom of the well, something that had been hidden deep beneath the surface of the water. As the water level got lower and lower, the object became clearer. It wasn't a rock or a piece of old equipment. It was a tangled mess of what looked like old clothes and bones. His blood ran cold. He knew immediately what he had to do. He stopped the pump and ran to get the sheriff. The discovery at the bottom of the well reopened a 5-year-old cold case. It turned out that before Carl, and even before the family who sold him the farm, the property had been owned by a man named Frank Lerman. Frank had employed several farmhands, including a young man named Henry Lipenstick. One day, 5 years earlier, Henry had simply vanished. He had no family or close friends in the area, so most people just assumed he had packed up and left town to find work elsewhere. But one of Frank's neighbors had her doubts. She went to the sheriff at the time and told him that she didn't think Henry had just left. She thought Frank Lerman might have had something to do with his disappearance. She said the two of them argued constantly, usually about money. She could hear them shouting at each other from her own property. She said there was real, palpable tension between them. The sheriff had tried to investigate her claim. He went to speak with Frank, but just as the investigation was getting started, Frank abruptly sold the farm and moved away without a forwarding address. With no body and no real evidence of foul play, the sheriff had no choice but to close the case. Until now. 5 years later, the body found at the bottom of Carl Lugisa's well was identified as Henry Lipenstick. His remains were badly decomposed, mostly skeletal, but identification was confirmed. An autopsy revealed that Henry had died from blunt force trauma to the head. His death was officially ruled a homicide. Frank Lerman was tracked down, arrested, and charged with second-degree murder. He was found guilty, but the conviction didn't stick. After only 7 months, his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence from so long ago, and he was released. But there was one more detail, one final, chilling piece to the story. When they carefully removed Henry's remains from the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was still wearing a watch on his skeletal wrist. The watch was broken, its hands frozen in time. It had stopped at 9:35 p.m. This was almost precisely the time, every single night for a year, that Carl Logis had seen that white, ghostly figure running towards the well before disappearing. After Henry Lipenstick's body was finally recovered and laid to rest in a proper grave, Carl Logis never saw the white figure on his farm ever again. The haunting was over. Our next story takes us forward in time a bit to the winter of 1933 and to a grand castle in southern Poland. Inside one of the castle's many lavish sitting rooms, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg was hosting a party for his friends. The room was filled with laughter and the smoke from expensive cigars. Anton, already quite drunk, was attempting to pour another round of drinks. He weaved his way back towards the card table where his friends were playing blackjack, but he stumbled, spilling most of the liquor onto a priceless carpet. Instead of being embarrassed, he just found it hilarious. So did his friends. They all roared with laughter as he clumsily picked up the nearly empty glasses from the floor. As a joke, he continued to the table and handed out the empty cups, and his friends, equally drunk and jovial, played along pretending to toast with them. The dealer for the next round began to pass out the cards. And it was in that moment that a loud, groaning creak echoed down from the ceiling right above them. The sound was so distinct and so loud that it cut through the noise of the party. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up. A moment of silence fell over the room. In that sudden quiet, Anton grinned and waved a dismissive hand. "Oh boy," he said with a chuckle. "That's just the monk." Most of his friends at the table knew what he was talking about. They had all heard Anton's favorite story about the castle being haunted by a so-called hooded monk. But there was one new friend in the group that night who hadn't heard the tale. He looked at Anton with a confused expression. "The monk? What are you talking about?" The other friends groaned playfully. They knew what was coming. Anton's eyes lit up. He loved telling this story. He turned to his new friend and launched into his well-rehearsed tale. He explained that when he first took ownership of the castle, he was told by the previous owners that the entire estate was his to enjoy, with one exception. There was a single bedroom on the second floor that was to remain locked and untouched at all times. The reason, they claimed, was that the room was haunted by the malevolent spirit of a hooded monk who patrolled it endlessly. Anton admitted to his friends that he had always heeded the warning. He had never once set foot inside that room. He had dozens of other bedrooms, so he didn't need it, but more than that, a part of him actually believed the story might be true. He liked the idea that his grand castle had a genuine, terrifying secret. He concluded his story by pointing a finger towards the ceiling. "And that bedroom," he said with a dramatic flair, "is right above us. So maybe that creak we just heard really was the monk." Usually, his friends would just humor him and move on. It was just a silly ghost story Anton liked to tell. But tonight, the new friend's reaction changed the dynamic. He stared at Anton in disbelief. "Wait a minute," he said. "You're telling me you own this entire castle, but there's a room in it that you've never been inside just because of some old ghost story? Are you serious?" As he said it out loud, the other friends started to see it from a new perspective. It did sound a bit cowardly when you put it like that. Suddenly, Anton's fun ghost story made him seem weak. They all started to pile on. "Yeah, Anton, what's the deal?" "It's your castle." "You can't be scared of one little room." Anton's cheerful mood quickly soured. He tried to brush it off, telling them to forget it and get back to the card game. But his friends wouldn't let it go. They were drunk and looking for some fun, and now they had a target. The goading turned into a dare. "You know what you should do, Anton? You should spend the night in that room. Tonight. Prove to us you're not afraid." At first, Anton refused. But his friends were relentless, and his drunken pride was on the line. He couldn't stand them thinking he was a coward in his own home. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table. "Fine," he declared. "I'll do it. I'll spend the night in there. I'll show you all it's just a stupid story." He probably assumed that by the time the party ended, everyone would be too drunk and tired to remember the dare. He figured he could just slip away to his own comfortable bedroom and no one would be the wiser. But his friends did not forget. When the card game finally wound down and it was time for everyone to go to bed, they all stood up and looked at Anton. "All right, Anton," one of them said with a grin. "Time to go to your new bedroom. We'll walk you up." Trapped by his own bravado, Anton had no choice but to lead the procession. The group of men, some stumbling, made their way out of the sitting room, up the grand staircase to the second floor, and down a long, dark hallway. They stopped in front of a heavy, ancient-looking wooden door. This was it. The forbidden room. Anton nervously fumbled with the old iron key he had retrieved. He put it in the lock and turned it. The mechanism groaned in protest, but it opened. Before pushing the door open, he turned to look at his friends one last time, a silent plea in his eyes. He was hoping they would let him off the hook. But they just stared back, their faces a mixture of curiosity and drunken amusement. They weren't backing down. "Go on," one of them urged. Anton sighed, turned back to the door, and pushed it open. He and his friends peered inside. For the first time, Anton laid eyes on the room he had avoided for so long. It was anticlimactic. It was just a bedroom, filled with old, heavy furniture that was covered in a thick layer of dust and draped with cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. It was creepy, but it just looked like an old, unused room. "All right, get in there," his friend said, nudging him forward. Anton gave them a weak smile. "Okay, I'll see you all in the morning," he said, trying to sound confident. He stepped over the threshold, into the dusty room. He then pulled the door shut behind him. His friends on the other side heard the distinct sound of the key turning in the lock. Anton was locking himself in for the night. Satisfied, his friends all walked back down the hall to their own guest rooms and went to sleep. Several hours later, in the dead of night, the silence of the castle was shattered. A terrible, blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It was a sound of pure terror, and it was clearly coming from the haunted bedroom where Anton was sleeping. His friends were jolted awake. They scrambled out of their beds and ran into the hallway, their hearts pounding. They rushed down the hall to the locked door and started banging on it, yelling Anton's name. They tried the handle, but it was locked solid, just as he had left it. "Anton! Are you okay? Open the door!" they shouted. But there was no response. The screaming had stopped as abruptly as it had started. Now, there was only a dead, heavy silence coming from inside the room. A wave of dread washed over them. The drunken dare didn't seem so funny anymore. That scream had sounded real. It was the sound of someone in mortal danger. Something was terribly wrong. They had to get in there. They threw their shoulders against the heavy oak door, but it wouldn't budge. They took a few steps back and rammed it together, again and again. The old wood splintered and groaned until finally, with a loud crack, the door flew off its hinges and crashed into the room. They stumbled inside, their eyes frantically searching the darkness. And then they saw him. The sight that met them was one they would never forget. Anton was lying on the bed, flat on his back. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of unimaginable horror frozen on his face. He was dead. As they cautiously approached the bed, they saw the only sign of what might have happened to him. Around his neck, there was a thin, red line. It looked like a ligature mark, the kind of mark left by a rope or a wire. But there was no rope. There was no wire. There was nothing in the room that could have made such a mark. The windows were sealed shut from years of neglect. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place, except for Anton, lying dead on the bed with that inexplicable red line around his throat. The authorities were called, and they conducted a thorough investigation. They searched the room from top to bottom. They confirmed what the friends already knew. The room had been sealed from the inside. There was no way anyone could have gotten in or out. They never found any kind of rope, cord, or weapon that could have caused the mark on Anton's neck. An autopsy was performed, but the medical examiner was baffled. They couldn't determine a cause of death. He hadn't been poisoned, and there were no other injuries. He was just dead. The case was a complete mystery. But it becomes even stranger when you learn the full story of the hooded monk, not just the watered-down version Anton used to tell at parties. The complete legend, passed down for centuries, was much more specific. The story went that an evil monk had been executed in that very room hundreds of years ago, and his vengeful spirit remained, forever, trapped inside. The legend also contained a specific warning. If anyone dared to spend the night in that room, the ghost of the monk would appear and strangle them to death with a thin rope. The thin red mark found on Anton Holberg's neck was a perfect match for the legend's description. To this day, his death remains officially unexplained. A young man who died alone, in a locked room, seemingly at the hands of a ghost. Our final story takes us back to the very beginning of the 20th century, to southeastern Wales. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 20th of January, 1907, a 57-year-old salt merchant named Samuel Hughes was dozing off on a passenger train. Sam was bone-tired. He had been working for nearly 24 hours straight. He had left his home in the small town of Blackwood early the previous morning and taken the train an hour south to the larger town of Newport, where he conducted most of his business. He had spent all of Saturday, from dawn until late into the night, meeting with clients and managing his accounts. Now, finally, he was on the last train home. He could barely keep his eyes open, his head lolling with the rhythm of the train. All he could think about was getting home, greeting his wife, and collapsing into his own warm bed. He had made this trip hundreds of times. He knew the route by heart. Even in his exhausted state, he could feel the train begin to slow down, and his body knew it was time. On autopilot, he gathered his bags, stood up, and shuffled out of his carriage and onto the platform. The train hissed and then pulled away, its red lights disappearing into the dark. Sam stood on the platform for a moment, waiting for the familiar sight of his local station. But, as his tired eyes adjusted, a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't his station. This wasn't Blackwood. In his exhausted stupor, he had gotten off the train one stop too early. He let out a groan of frustration. The train was gone. This was 1907. There wouldn't be another one until morning. He didn't have a phone to call a cab. He was stranded, in the middle of the night, in a town he didn't recognize. He had two choices. He could try to find an inn and spend the night, or he could try to walk home. He wasn't even sure how far away Blackwood was from here. First things first, he needed to find someone to ask for help. He stepped off the deserted platform and started walking towards a few faint lights he could see in the distance. He didn't have high hopes of finding anyone out and about at this hour, in what was clearly a very small rural town. But to his surprise, he hadn't walked for more than a few minutes when he saw another person approaching an intersection up ahead. As they got closer, he saw the uniform and realized it was a police officer on his nightly patrol. A wave of relief washed over Sam. He flagged the officer down. The officer was a bit suspicious at first, seeing a well-dressed man with luggage wandering around in the middle of the night. Sam quickly explained his foolish mistake, how he'd gotten off the train at the wrong stop. He asked the officer if there was a place to stay nearby, or if it was possible to walk to Blackwood. The officer was friendly and helpful. He told Sam that there were a couple of inns in town, but if he was feeling up to it, Blackwood was only about an hour's walk away. The officer said if it were him, he'd probably just make the walk and get home. Sam thought about it. As tired as he was, the thought of sleeping in his own bed was too tempting. He decided to walk. He asked the officer for directions. The officer explained that it was a straight shot. He just needed to follow the main road for about an hour. He would eventually come to a bridge. Once he crossed that bridge, he would see signs for Blackwood. It was simple. Sam thanked the officer profusely, picked up his bags, and set off down the dark road, heading for home. Several hours later, a little after 3 in the morning, Sam's wife Bess was wide awake in their home in Blackwood. She was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. She was worried. She knew Sam had a long day, but he should have been home by now. He was usually very predictable. For him to be this late without any word was highly unusual, and a knot of anxiety was tightening in her stomach. She sat there, listening to the old house creak and groan, her mind imagining all sorts of terrible things that could have happened. And then she heard it. It was Sam's voice, calling out her name from outside. Bess. "I'm home!" It sounded like he was just out front. He must have seen the lights on in the house and known she was waiting up for him. Bess was overcome with relief. He was safe. Her husband was home. She grabbed a candle, her hands trembling slightly, and hurried to the front door to let him in. She unlatched the door and pulled it open, a happy greeting on her lips. But the words died in her throat. It wasn't her husband. Sam was nowhere in sight. Instead, standing on her porch, just inches away from her, was a dark figure. It was tall and cloaked in black, and it was just standing there, silent and still, looking right at her. Bess froze. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. A bizarre sense of calm washed over her as she looked at this strange apparition. She didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but she felt no sense of threat. She just stood there, holding her candle, staring at the figure. And as she looked closer, she noticed a detail. On its head, the figure was wearing a black silk hat. Her husband Sam owned a hat just like it. In fact, he wore it almost every day. She knew for a fact he had been wearing it that morning when he left for Newport. She stared at this figure, wearing what looked like her husband's hat, and remembered hearing her husband's voice just moments before. She didn't imagine it. He had called to her. And then, Bess blinked. And in that instant, the figure was gone. It had simply vanished. The hat, the cloak, all of it. Her porch was empty. Now, the fear hit her. The calm was gone, replaced by a chilling terror. Had she imagined it all? What was happening? She thought maybe Sam was outside, hurt. Maybe he had called to her and then collapsed. She ran out of the house, holding her candle, and started searching the property, calling his name over and over. But Sam wasn't there. After a frantic search, she went back inside, her mind reeling. She sat up for a few more hours, waiting and watching, but Sam never came home. Eventually, exhausted and confused, she went to bed. When Bess woke up late the next afternoon, Sam still wasn't home. The bright sunlight made the strange vision from the night before seem even more unreal. She told herself she must have been half asleep, that she had dreamt the whole thing. Sam was fine, she reassured herself. He probably just got delayed in Newport and would be home soon. As she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay, she heard a sharp knock on the front door. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was Sam. She rushed to the door and opened it. It was a police officer, the same one who had spoken to Sam the night before. He had a grim expression on his face, and he removed his helmet. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I have some terrible news." He explained what had happened. The night before, Sam had followed his directions, walking along the dark road towards Blackwood. He had made it all the way to the bridge that the officer had told him about. He was so close to home. But somehow, either because he was so exhausted or because it was so dark, he had made a fatal misstep. He had fallen from the bridge. His body had been discovered that morning. As Bess listened, her world collapsing around her, her mind inexplicably flashed back to the dark figure on her porch. Without thinking, she asked the officer a strange question. "What time do you think he died?" The officer paused, a bit taken aback, but then he answered. He said that based on when he had spoken to Sam and how long the walk to the bridge would have taken, they estimated that he likely fell sometime around 3 in the morning. The time was a perfect match. That was right around when she had heard Sam's voice and seen the figure. And then she thought of the hat. That distinct black silk hat. She had to know. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "When you found him, was he wearing his hat?" The officer looked confused by the question, but answered it. "No, ma'am," he said. "He wasn't wearing a hat at all. We couldn't find one at the scene." In that moment, Bess knew. As heartbreaking as it was, she knew exactly what she had seen on her porch. It hadn't been a dream or a figment of her imagination. Who or what she saw, the dark figure in the cloak wearing her husband's black silk hat, had been Sam's spirit. He had fallen from the bridge and died, and his soul had come home one last time to say goodbye. The figure wearing his hat was his way of letting her know it was really him. Bess would go on to tell her story to a local reporter, and the tale of the ghostly goodbye was printed in newspapers all across Wales, a haunting reminder that sometimes love is strong enough to cross even the final boundary between life and death. The strange thing about stories like these is that no matter how much evidence you uncover, one piece never seems to fit. A ghost seen at the exact moment of death. A locked room with no escape. A figure returning home after falling into darkness. Maybe some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Thanks for watching, and if you're brave enough for one more story tonight, there's a playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time. On the afternoon of Saturday, the 6th of February, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lilu set up an ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a small house just outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could just make out the rich smell of beef bourguignon simmering on the stove. But Alan and the 37-year-old woman cooking the meal were not speaking to each other. The silence in the house was heavy and uncomfortable. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and this house, the one they were currently in, was a house Alan had bought for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra had started out as Alan's assistant many years ago, but over time, their relationship had evolved into something much deeper, something more like a father and a daughter. Even now, years after Alexandra had stopped working for him, they remained incredibly close. And of course, Alan had literally bought her this home to ensure she and her daughter had a stable life. As a result of this close bond, Alan found himself visiting her often, helping out around the house, doing small chores, and just being a presence in her life. He also paid for her car and for their vacations. Alan could certainly afford to be this generous. He was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a surprisingly huge business in France. Many large companies would book entire circus shows for their end-of-the-year parties for employees, and Alan had managed to secure many major lucrative contracts. His business was so successful that his main office was located in a fancy chateau in the countryside. His wife, Elizabeth, lived in a separate home, a luxury ski town near the Swiss border. Alan himself was constantly on the move, traveling all over Europe for his work. But this fast-paced life could also be a real grind. In just the past 24 hours, Alan had driven more than 1,200 miles, racing between meetings with potential clients and scouting for new circus performers. So he placed a lot of value on the quiet time he could spend at Alexandra's house. It was his escape, a place where he could recharge in the peaceful suburbs and, more importantly, spend time with someone he cared a great deal about. Now, Alan wasn't naive. He knew that his friends and his coworkers all assumed he and Alexandra were having an affair. He was almost certain that's what his own wife, Elizabeth, believed as well. And to be fair, their assumptions weren't entirely baseless. Alan was known to have plenty of extramarital relationships. He also frequently engaged with sex workers and made very little effort to hide any of it from anyone. He and his wife lived completely separate lives, and they seemed to have a silent understanding. She had her life of luxury in the mountains, and he had his freedom to do as he pleased. But Alan's relationship with Alexandra was genuinely different. It had always been platonic. They had never so much as kissed or even held hands. Alan had no children of his own, and he truly enjoyed playing the role of a father figure to Alexandra and a grandfather figure to her young daughter. But right now, they were in the middle of a big fight, and Alan was anxious to fix it. Alexandra's daughter was away for the weekend, staying with friends. So he and Alexandra had planned to have a nice, quiet dinner together this evening before Alan had to get back on the road for another business trip on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, in a moment he now deeply regretted, had somewhat stupidly brought up Alexandra's past. And what started as a simple conversation had quickly escalated into a horrible fight. They had been yelling at each other on and off ever since. Alexandra was intensely defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris full of dreams. She had fallen in love and had a baby, but the baby had tragically died. Her relationship fell apart soon after, and she had spiraled into a period of very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alan first met her back in 2002, which was 8 years before this argument in the little house, Alexandra was at a very low point. She had a 2-year-old daughter by then and was struggling immensely to provide for her. She was working a patchwork of minimum wage jobs and small side hustles, barely making ends meet. So when Alan had offered her a job as his full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. It gave her stability and a future. But deep down, there was a part of her that seemed to resent Alan's power over her more than she was grateful for his help. It was like he had total control over her well-being, her home, her car, her entire life. And she didn't always like that feeling of dependency. And so, with all that weighing on his mind, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen. He was hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could finally have a real, calm conversation. Once he was in the kitchen, he glanced over at Alexandra, who was stirring the pot on the stove, her back to him. He couldn't quite read her mood. He turned, opened the refrigerator door, and just stared inside, not really looking for anything to eat or drink. He was just biding his time, hoping she would be the first one to speak. To his immense relief, Alexandra did turn around. She playfully swung a dish towel at his arm, telling him he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad anymore. Alan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He smiled and closed the fridge door. He then suggested she come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the last load of laundry to dry so he could finish the ironing for her. A few minutes later, they were both sitting on the sofa, each with a glass of red wine. Alexandra asked Alan how his business was going. He told her it was good, which was technically true. His company was on track to bring in around $4 million that year, which is about $5 million today. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was feeling a lot of stress. He made the vast majority of his money through those big corporate contracts. But he wasn't the only one in the game. His number one competitor was another circus owner named Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been outbidding Alan on one contract after another. It was starting to feel personal, like Michel was specifically targeting Alan's existing clients, trying to steal them away from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own business. Alan explained to Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, a city in central France, which was about a 4-hour drive south of her house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to land a huge contract, a real game changer for the year, as long as Michel didn't swoop in and steal it out from under him again. Alexandra gently put her hand on Alan's arm and told him not to worry. She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success. She suggested they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to take care of the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan sat by himself for a moment, just thinking. He was really looking forward to that vacation she had mentioned. In part, it was because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately. She had a new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Alan and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that things were getting pretty serious between Alexandra and Yves. They might even get married. And Alan couldn't help but worry that if that happened, Yves might eventually start to resent him for his role in Alexandra's life. He worried that Yves might see him as an overbearing figure who was a little too involved. But he decided he wasn't going to let that fear ruin the evening. As Alexandra came back into the living room with a basket of laundry, Alan picked up a book from the coffee table and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, packed and ready, heading out of town for his big meeting. But what no one would realize until much, much later was that there was a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a cup of coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up and heard the voice of Alan's longtime assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried. She was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. This was a strange call to receive. Alan was a creature of habit when it came to his work. He was not the type of person to just disappear and not tell his secretary where he was going. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. Then she asked Sylvie what was going on. And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's explanation, she felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Apparently, Alan had that very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had never shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he had a reservation for the night before. Sylvie said she had already tried reaching out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he wasn't answering the repeated calls she was making to both of his cell phones, which both appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days glued to his phones. He was always in communication with someone. She couldn't even recall a single time when he'd been unreachable, even for a few minutes. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she had called, but that she would take over from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and immediately called the police to report her husband missing. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres. Up until this point, Allen's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case. The local police in Allen's wife's hometown were handling the initial inquiry, which was pretty basic. They had made a few phone calls and filed the standard reports. But now, enough time had passed without any sign of Allen and with no new evidence coming in. The original report had been escalated to the Criminal Investigation Division. They were now considering the possibility that this could be a kidnapping or something even worse. This young officer was now standing at this particular house because it was the last place Allen was known to have been before he vanished. The door of the home opened, and a thin, blonde woman looked out at him. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she confirmed that it was. When he explained to her that he was there as part of the investigation into Allen Lilu's disappearance, Alexandra's face immediately clouded with concern, and she invited him inside. As she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking a mental inventory of the space. The house was clean, but a bit cluttered with toys that obviously belonged to a young girl, scattered here and there. The officer scanned the room for any signs of a physical struggle or any kind of violence, things like damage to the walls or overturned furniture, but there was nothing that stood out. Nothing seemed out of place or concerning. Alexandra started asking the officer a series of anxious questions about what was going on with Allen. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? What did the police know? But the young officer just shook his head and explained that for now, they really didn't know much at all. He was just there to try to build a clear timeline of Allen's last known movements. And so, speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Allen. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to recount all the details she could recall. She explained that Allen was like a surrogate father to her and that he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had stayed with her on Friday, all day Saturday, and then had left on Sunday afternoon. He had to get on the road to drive to Vichy for his big meeting on Monday morning. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but she said that was pretty typical for them. She stressed that their relationship was not romantic in any way. It was truly platonic, and he didn't always check in with her the way a spouse or a romantic partner would. It was more like they were just really close friends. The officer nodded as he wrote down everything she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and genuinely worried, but he was still suspicious of the idea that she and Allen were not romantically involved. It just seemed unlikely given the circumstances. So, before he left, he asked if he could see the rest of her house. He was doing this in part just to gauge her reaction. If she said no or got defensive, he would know to probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed without any hesitation. And she gave him a full tour, taking him all around the house and showing him any room he wanted to see. What he found was that the rest of the house seemed just as normal and unremarkable as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the front door and promised him that she would call immediately if Allen reached out to her. And so, after leaving Alexandra's house, the officer, wanting to be thorough, went door to door up and down Alexandra's street. He asked her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend, trying to see if anything they said contradicted Alexandra's story. But everyone he spoke to more or less confirmed what she had told him. Allen was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question. They all said that nothing had seemed off or unusual at all. So, eventually, the officer left and went back to the station. When he got there, he wrote up his report highlighting Allen's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Allen's wife lived, continued to follow up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Allen's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions. Everything showed no activity at all after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and all of his friends, but no one had heard anything. They even put in an official request to the car company, Audi, for the GPS data that was stored in Allen's car, which was a large Audi Q7 SUV. The investigators knew it was entirely possible that Allen had chosen to disappear. He was very wealthy, he had lots of connections all over Europe. It was a possibility that he had simply decided to walk away from his life. And if that was the case, it would be incredibly difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Allen's disappearance was voluntary, an accident, or the result of foul play, the police knew that finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even begin looking for Allen. On the 26th of February 2010, 19 days since Allen had been reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Allen's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that the police had requested from Audi had finally come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising location. Again, the last place where Allen was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola, near Chartres, and supposedly heading to Vichy for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or in Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered abandoned in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was a city roughly in between those two other cities. And so, to the police, it looked like he had gotten about halfway to his destination and then just stopped for some reason. When they had first located the car, the first thing they did was set up a surveillance team to watch it for 2 full days. They wanted to see if maybe Allen or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where the car was found was in a pretty rough part of town, an area where violent crime and sex work were common. So it was possible that any number of people could potentially approach the car or try to break into it. It just seemed like a seedy enough area where if they watched it long enough, something might happen. But after 2 days, nobody had shown up. So, finally, they just had the car towed to the impound lot so that forensic technicians could process it and look for any evidence. And Detective Martin was here to personally oversee that process. The forensic techs began to circle the vehicle, taking photos of the outside from every angle and carefully dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the exterior of the car, and there were no signs of any attempt to break into it. Plus, when they looked through the windows, they could see Allen's briefcase and his luggage were still sitting inside the car. This meant that the car being found where it was likely not the result of a simple car theft. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car for a joyride and then dumped it. It seemed like how this car got here was directly connected to what had happened to Allen. And as he followed that line of thinking, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Allen probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians finally opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery and the dashboard were disappointingly clean. There was nothing there. This didn't exactly support the idea that foul play had occurred inside the car. It just deepened the mystery. But after a few more minutes of thoroughly scanning the interior of the car, one of the technicians pushed a button near the driver's side door that electronically opened the trunk. After the trunk lid lifted open, Detective Martin walked around to the back of the SUV to look inside. And what he saw was a bulky object wrapped completely in a pink bedsheet. And right away, Martin had a sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and carefully pulled the sheet back. And almost immediately, Martin's worst suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body. It was a man's body, fully clothed and curled up in the fetal position. There was no doubt in his mind that this was Allen Lilu. But there was no visible blood, no wounds, and no bruises anywhere on his body. And there was no blood in the trunk itself. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Allen's body to examine him further, he found that his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner on the scene told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she conducted the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been very cold, which was actually good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had acted like a refrigerator, preserving Allen's soft tissues. As the coroner wheeled the body away on a gurney, Martin just stood there, staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Allen had died. All he knew for certain was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got straight to work. Since Allen's body was found in Orleans, the jurisdiction for the case fell to him, and he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and all the other evidence that had already been gathered by the other police departments. And right away, the picture these files painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with a lot of potential suspects and multiple locations to consider. Allen was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orleans where his body had ended up. In fact, it seemed he rarely spent more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, his life seemed to be a constant balancing act between his office, a series of hotels, with frequent stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to the reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she had confirmed that Allen was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so, this made her the last known person to see Allen alive, which, in Martin's mind, automatically made her a person of interest. However, Alexandra's story about Allen leaving her house on Sunday, February 7th, seemed to match up perfectly with the data Martin had from Allen's car, his cell phone, and his credit card records. All of those records showed that Allen really did leave her house and travel to Orleans on that day, and then, for reasons that were still unknown, all communication and all financial activity just stopped. It seemed very likely that was the day he was killed. Right from the beginning, just like the young police officer who had originally visited Alexandra and taken her statement, Detective Martin found it very hard to believe that her relationship with Allen was not romantic. It just seemed, based on how frequently they saw each other and the fact that Allen was buying her major things like a house and a car and paying for vacations, that there had to be more to the story than what they were being told. But even though that cast a certain level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of the situation for Detective Martin. The size difference between Allen and Alexandra was significant. Allen was a big guy. He weighed about 240 pounds. And Alexandra was very small and petite. Now, was it impossible for her to kill him, lift his body into the trunk of his car, and dump it in Orleans? No, it wasn't impossible. But it just seemed very unlikely. And so that idea was just sort of floating in the back of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Allen's business associates and his wife had provided. First off, Allen apparently had a lot of affairs with a lot of different women. And so, that meant that every single one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners connected to them, were also potential suspects. It also meant that Allen's wife, Elizabeth, had a very clear motive to want her husband dead. Basically, he was openly cheating on her all the time. That had to be a powerful motivation for her to want him gone. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth would have literally done the killing herself, because her phone records and other evidence showed she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband was likely killed. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman to do it for her. And the second thing that Detective Martin learned from the business associates and from Allen's wife was that Allen's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Allen's employees and his colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless businessman. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was always flying around. And so, because Martin had been handed this murder investigation with an overwhelming number of potential suspects, instead of just being paralyzed by where to even start, Martin assembled a team of his very best deputies. And they set to work, meticulously re-interviewing every single person connected to Allen, and, from those interviews, making a new, prioritized list of suspects. 3 weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station. He sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and seemed very calm. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Alan's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anyone else's. And this was because immediately after Alan had disappeared, Michel had started aggressively contacting all of Alan's clients, trying to get them to sign new contracts with his company instead. It was a pretty cutthroat and cold-hearted thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on the value of these contracts Michel was going after. They added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which, in the detective's mind, was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel had killed Alan specifically to absorb his business. And not only that, but the coroner had, by this point, come back with Alan's official cause of death. He had been strangled, likely using some kind of ligature like a rope or a belt. And the coroner estimated that it likely took between 5 to maybe even 10 minutes for Alan to actually die. That meant that someone had been actively strangling him for a very long time. That is a long, physically demanding time to be right on top of somebody, killing them. And there were also some scratches found on Alan's legs, which suggested that his body had been lifted and dragged into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, had clearly taken place somewhere else outside of the car, and all of that meant that whoever killed Alan had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he certainly fit that description. He seemed like a fit, strong man. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and his body language for any signs of anxiety or defensiveness that might suggest he was hiding something, what he found was that Michel seemed completely open and very straightforward. He acted like he had nothing to hide. Michel immediately acknowledged that he had been trying to poach Alan's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. He said that was just business. He said he was sure that if their positions had been reversed, Alan would have done the exact same thing to him. And besides, he said, he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Alan had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away on a ski trip. And then Michel produced a folder that was full of receipts and a list of phone numbers of people who could verify his story. He handed it over to Martin, who took it. He told Michel to sit tight. Then the detective got up and left the interrogation room. He handed the folder over to another detective and told him to start checking everything out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to go in and take a shot at questioning Michel. The idea was to create a sort of good cop, bad cop dynamic to see if maybe a new face and a new approach would rattle Michel. And so, Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and tried to break Michel's story. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So, Martin signaled for yet another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a very run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel and made no progress at all. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michel in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around, and it was one of his deputies. The deputy told Martin that, unfortunately, he had called all the people on Michel's list, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had even spoken to the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michel's alibi was solid. It had checked out completely. He clearly could not have physically been able to kill Alan. He was verifiably at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he couldn't just keep Michel there indefinitely, just hoping to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some remote possibility he was involved, there just wasn't enough evidence to hold him. And so, he had to let Michel go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk, combing through the case files again, when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was someone at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. This was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local newspapers, basically saying, "Hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me." And he was hoping that whoever this person was potentially that witness. And so, Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby. And there, he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was a man who appeared to be in his early 50s, and he was dressed all in black, with shiny black shoes and dark glasses. Martin wondered if maybe this was another one of Alan's business contacts. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then, this man introduced himself. And when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. The man said his name was Remy Seren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even wasting his time by bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy, "Thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this, you need to go." But then he thought better of it. The truth was, Martin was having absolutely no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints. And while the pink bedsheet that Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their criminal database. And then, the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either. And he'd found no evidence at all that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles had taken out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with, and even all the sex workers they could find who he had engaged with. And none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made any sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little bit of curiosity and a whole lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy, the psychic, back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought he knew. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving in his car. And when he heard the story, he had a vision that was so vivid and so powerful that he actually had to pull over to the side of the road. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day, locked in a physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her face, but he was certain that a woman was somehow directly involved in Alan's murder. At first, Martin was disappointed. Unsurprisingly, this just felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody pretending to be a psychic, someone who claimed they could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw out this random generic idea as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say that he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orléans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and placed in the trunk of the car after he was already dead. And this immediately caught Martin's attention. Because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transport, but critically, the police had not released that specific piece of information to the press. They had held it back specifically so they could weed out fake tips and false confessions. And so, for Remy to say that, how would he have known that detail? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy. But it just seemed so specific, so on the nose, that he began to reconsider what else Remy had said. This idea that Alan was struggling with a woman, that was something that Martin had not really considered seriously. He had sort of ruled most women out as the primary suspect because of how big Alan had been and how physical and brutal this murder had to have been. It just seemed much more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly, it seemed entirely possible that maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk because he had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had many extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had already spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy. It was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew that Allen engaged with sex workers. That was one of the things he did. And they had spoken to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as suspects. And so, for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as a primary suspect pool. However, now, with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Allen was in Orleans in the first place was because he was there to meet a sex worker. And while he was there, something went terribly wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Allen's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Allen's emails and his business records. But Martin was looking for something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Allen had found sex workers to visit. Basically, what he was doing was making a new, truly exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever engaged with online. This was a much bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through. And as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to track down and speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Allen was engaging with had any connection to the city of Orleans. And they also did not appear to have any real issues with Allen himself, at least not based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came across one new profile. This woman was named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was, and saw her picture, and read her information, he knew right then and there that he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a full confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Allen Lilu on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Allen, and inside they were burning with a white-hot rage. Allen seemed to think he was so much better than the killer just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was, in his eyes, just a sex worker. The killer had tolerated Allen's condescending behavior for a long time because Allen had money and power. But now, Allen had pushed it too far. The killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Allen's own belt lay on a nearby chair. And impulsively, the killer grabbed it. They lunged forward and looped the leather belt around Allen's throat from behind. At first, Allen struggled. He reached up with his large hands, trying to pull the belt off. He had no idea what was happening, but the killer just held on tight, pulling with all their might. And for several agonizing minutes, there was this unbelievable death struggle going on in the quiet house. And Allen, he was fighting for his life. He was a big guy, and he was getting close to pulling the belt free. But then, something unbelievable happened. The killer had braced themselves against the ironing board that was set up behind them. And so, with their back pressed up against it, they were pulling as hard as they could with the belt against Allen's throat. And as they were leaning back with all their weight, the ironing board they were braced against suddenly broke. The legs buckled. And because the killer didn't let go of the belt and was applying maximum pressure, when they fell backwards, it created a violent whiplash effect. Their body tumbled to the floor, and all of that force was driven instantly into Allen's throat. That sudden, violent jerk crushed Allen's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so, just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Allen was dead. And when Allen did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of the body. This was a huge man. How were they going to get rid of it on their own? So, the killer called their accomplice. The accomplice was hundreds of miles away at a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait, and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived. And together, they helped the killer load Allen's body into the trunk of Allen's own car. Then, the killer climbed into the driver's seat of Allen's car and drove it to the train station in Orleans. And following behind them as they made this grim journey was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Alan's car and his body in that rough part of Orleans, and then together they would drive away in the second car. Shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Alan's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. And Alexandra's troubled past that she was so defensive about included the fact that she was a sex worker who used the online name Marie Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Alan had fought previously about her troubled history. She was especially mad that at one point Alan had implied that Alexandra's daughter could end up just like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on that Saturday, February 6th, when Alan brought up Alexandra's daughter again, just in conversation, something inside of Alexandra snapped. It just felt so deeply disrespectful that he was once again talking about her daughter in that way, and out of pure impulse, she had grabbed his belt, wrapped it around his neck, strangled him, and then, in that freak accident, stumbled backwards, crushing his larynx and killing him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her. Alan had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had conveniently left out was that Alan was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Alan Lilu and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for the concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released from prison, and together, they have a child who was born before Alexandra began her sentence. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 1986, life for the Andrews family was turned completely upside down. The two teenage sisters, Annie and Jessica, suddenly and tragically lost their mother to cancer. Her death was fairly abrupt, and it caught everyone by surprise, leaving a huge hole in the family. After she was gone, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian. Now, Brian had always been a hard worker, but with the loss of his wife, he had to take on even more hours just to make ends meet and provide for his two daughters. The general has intensive. He was a single father now, and the weight of that was immense. For Annie and Jessica, the loss was devastating. They had been incredibly close with their mom, and now, with their dad gone at work so often, the house felt quiet and empty. The two sisters were left alone a lot, just them and their thoughts, and all they could think about was how much they missed their mother. The grief was a constant, heavy presence in the house. So one night, while Brian was out on a late shift, the girls came up with an idea. They decided they would try to use a Ouija board to contact their mom. They would later admit they didn't really expect anything to happen, but they were just so desperate for some kind of connection, any sign that she was still with them. They went down into the basement and found the old board game. They set it up, but they didn't really do any research on how a seance was supposed to work. They just sat down, put their hands on the planchette, and started asking simple questions. They asked if their mother was there. They asked if she could give them a sign. For a couple of hours, they sat there in the quiet basement, focusing all their energy on their mom. And of course, nothing really happened. The planchette didn't move on its own. There were no strange noises or flickering lights. Eventually, they decided to put the board away. But in a way, the whole experience was cathartic for them. It gave them a chance to just sit and think about their mom, to talk to her, and to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could hear them. Even if it was just in their heads, it made them feel closer to her for a little while. So, feeling a bit better, they put the Ouija board away and went back upstairs. They had a quiet rest of the evening and eventually decided to just head to bed. Their father still wasn't home, but this was normal. They were used to it. Annie and Jessica went to their separate bedrooms, and as they were lying there in the dark trying to fall asleep, they both started to hear something. It was a faint tapping sound. At first, they probably thought they were imagining it. But the sound was persistent. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Jessica got up and quietly went into Annie's room. She whispered, asking if Annie heard the tapping too. And Annie said yes, she did. They sat there together, listening intently. The house would fall silent, and then it would start again. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the structure of the house. They had never heard anything like it before. Now, these two girls were grieving deeply. Their minds immediately went back to the seance they had just performed. Could it be? Was this the sign they had asked for? They wanted to believe it so badly, they started whispering to each other that it must be their mom. She was trying to get in touch with them. The seance must have actually worked. And so, what started as a potentially scary sound turned into something hopeful. They started asking questions out loud into the empty room. They asked, "Mom, are you here with us right now?" They asked if she could show herself, if she was okay, if she was watching over them. It was a strange mix of fear and comfort. The idea of a spirit in their house was unsettling, but the thought that it was their mother's spirit there to look after them was deeply reassuring. When their father, Brian, finally got home from work that night, the tapping had stopped. The girls rushed to tell him what happened. They were excited, not scared. They told him about the Ouija board and then about the tapping sounds in the walls, convinced it was their mom. Brian was exhausted. He'd worked a long day, and he was still processing his own grief over losing his wife. He listened to his daughters, and his heart broke for them. He was sure they were just making it up, a product of their grief and their desire to have their mother back. He thought, they're struggling, they miss their mom so much, and this is how it's coming out. That first night, he even considered getting them into some kind of therapy or grief counseling, not because he was angry, but because he was worried. He saw this as a clear sign that they weren't coping well. But for now, he just tried to calm them down. He told them, "Look, girls, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for all of us." He didn't want to dismiss their feelings entirely, but he also didn't want to encourage what he saw as a fantasy. So, the girls went back to their rooms, and Brian didn't think too much more of it that night. He was just a tired, grieving father worried about his kids. But the tapping didn't stop. Over the next several days, it continued, and it actually started to get more frequent. It got so persistent that it began to disturb the girls' sleep. Night after night, they would lie awake, listening to the tapping inside the walls. And every time they would get scared and call for their father to come check on it, the moment he would step into the room, the tapping would stop. It was maddening for them. It made them feel like they were going crazy. Then, other strange things started to happen. When the family would leave the house for the day, for school or work, they would come back to find things out of place. It was always small things, subtle changes. A piece of furniture would be moved just slightly from its original position. Some of the silverware in the kitchen drawer would be rearranged. Little objects on shelves would be shifted around. It was just enough to be noticeable, to create a feeling that someone or something had been there while they were gone. Of course, Annie and Jessica were convinced it was the spirit of their mother. But Brian was having none of it. He sat them down and told them firmly that this had to stop. He said, "Guys, I know this is you. I know how much you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real. You want her to be here with us, but she's not. You have to stop moving the furniture around. This whole ghost thing is not healthy." He warned them that if it continued, he was going to insist they start seeing a grief counselor. For the girls, this was a terrible blow. They were adamant that it wasn't them. They were genuinely scared now. And the fact that their own father didn't believe them made them feel completely alone. The initial comfort they had felt, the belief that it was their mother, was starting to fade. This didn't feel like something their mom would do. Moving things around, playing games, trying to scare them, it felt more sinister. They started to think that maybe when they used that Ouija board, they had let something else in. Something evil. And now it was in their house, terrorizing them, and there was nothing they could do because the one person who was supposed to protect them thought they were making it all up. One evening in January of 1987, a few weeks into this strange ordeal, the girls were together in the front room of the house, and they started to hear the tapping sounds again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls around them. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. After weeks of being scared and feeling helpless, something inside them snapped. They felt a sudden surge of confidence, or maybe just desperation. They decided they were going to go down there and confront whatever this thing was. Their father wasn't home to help, and he wouldn't believe them anyway. They had to face this on their own. So they took a deep breath and headed for the basement stairs. As they went down, the tapping stopped. The basement was quiet and still. They looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. They couldn't find any source for the noise. Feeling a little bit foolish, like they were on a ghost hunt that had led nowhere, they turned to go back upstairs. But as they did, they saw it. Scrawled on the basement wall in what looked like red paint or marker were the words, "Come find me. I'm in your closet." They froze. This was different. This was terrifying. It was no longer just tapping or moved furniture. This was a direct message. It was confirmation that something was actively messing with them, taunting them. It wasn't their mother. This felt like a threat. The girls didn't hesitate. They screamed and ran out of the basement, out of the house, and straight next door to their neighbors. They pounded on the door, hysterical, and told their neighbors that something weird was happening in their house. They tried to explain about the writing on the wall, but they were probably not making much sense. The neighbors, seeing how genuinely terrified they were, let them in and told them to just wait there until their father got home. A little while later, they saw Brian's car pull into the driveway. They ran out and flagged him down, and he came over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor pulled Brian aside and explained what had happened, that the girls had come over in a complete panic. Annie and Jessica then told their dad that there was writing on the wall in the basement. Brian's first reaction was frustration. This was just too much. He thought now they're defacing the property to keep this fantasy going. For him, this was the line. It had gone from a coping mechanism to something totally unhealthy. Still, he went over to the house with them to see for himself. He went down into the basement, and there it was, just as they had described. Red writing on the wall. But instead of being scared, he was just angry at his daughters. He immediately ordered them to start grief counseling. This was no longer a suggestion, it was a demand. And so, they began seeing a therapist. And for a while, it seemed to work. For several weeks after that incident, the house was completely silent. There was no tapping. Nothing was ever out of place. It was almost like whatever had been haunting them had just given up and left. Then, one night, Brian was working late again and the girls were home alone. They were sitting together in the front room, enjoying the peace and quiet they had finally gotten back. And then, they heard it. The tapping. It was back. They got up and slowly, cautiously made their way through the house, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It led them to Annie's bedroom. When they opened the door and looked inside, their hearts sank. Written on her bedroom wall were new words. "I'm back. Find me if you can." It was happening all over again. They did the only thing they could think to do. They ran. They fled the house and went straight back to the same neighbor's house. They explained that it had happened again, begging the neighbor to believe them. The neighbor let them stay, and they all waited for Brian to come home. When he arrived, the same scene played out. He was flagged down and brought over to the neighbors. This time, when he heard the story, Brian was furious. He confronted the girls, saying, "I put you in counseling. I told you to stop doing this. This is not okay." He was at his wit's end. He then told the girls and the neighbor to stay right where they were. He was going to go into that house himself and search it from top to bottom. He was going to prove to them, once and for all, that there was nothing to be afraid of. So he marched back over to his own house, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. And he stopped dead in his tracks. The house was in total disarray. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, things were thrown everywhere. And his first thought was, the girls didn't do this. Someone else had been in his house. Suddenly, he was on edge. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold fear. He walked cautiously through the trashed rooms, listening for any sound, but it was silent. He made his way upstairs to Annie's bedroom. He saw the writing on the wall, just as they had described. And then he looked towards the closet, and he saw a man standing there. The man was wearing women's clothes. In fact, they were his dead wife's clothes. He was also wearing a wig and carrying a small hatchet. This figure, this man in a dress, was just standing in the closet, staring at Brian. Brian was completely startled. For a second, he was just frozen. Then, the man in the dress started running. He charged out of the closet, and Brian, reacting on instinct, tried to grab him to fight him, but the man was fast and managed to push past Brian and run out of the room. Brian, shaken but now filled with adrenaline, started chasing after him. But the guy was quick. By the time Brian got downstairs, the man was gone. He searched the house frantically, but there was no sign of him. Realizing the man had a hatchet, Brian decided the safest thing to do was get out. He ran out of the house back to his neighbors and yelled for them to call 911. There was an intruder. He stayed with his daughters while the police arrived. They went into the house and conducted a thorough search. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find anyone. They told Brian that they were sure someone had been there based on his very convincing story and the state of the house, but the person was long gone now. There wasn't much they could do other than advise him not to stay there that night. They said they would keep an eye on the house, do some patrols, but until the intruder was caught, it wasn't safe for the family to be there. And so, the family was left with no answers. Who was that person? How did he get in? And more importantly, how did he get away? Brian was racking his brain. A man in a dress carrying a hatchet is a pretty distinctive sight. How could he just vanish into the neighborhood without anyone seeing him? For the next 2 weeks, Brian and his daughters stayed with relatives. It was a horrible, traumatizing time. Brian was consumed with guilt. He felt like a terrible father. He had left his girls alone night after night in a house with some crazy person living inside of it. He had never believed them. He kept thinking about what could have happened and how it would have been all his fault. The girls were equally traumatized. They now knew that for weeks they had been interacting with a real, dangerous person who was hiding in their home, a person with an axe. But after 2 weeks, living with relatives in a cramped space was getting difficult. And at this point, they reasoned that whoever that man was, he must be long gone. The police were watching the house. They decided it was time to go home. They would get a new security system, be more careful, but they had to get back to their lives. So, they packed up their things and headed back. As Brian was driving up his own street, he looked at his house, and he noticed something odd. There was a light on in one of the second-floor windows. He thought that was strange. He knew the police were patrolling the neighborhood, but he didn't think they were actually inside his house. As he was looking up at that window, about to pull into his driveway, he saw him. The man in the dress. He walked right past the window, clear as day. Brian slammed on the brakes. He immediately grabbed his daughters, made sure they were safe, and called the police again. This time, he knew the man was still inside. Police were there in seconds. They surrounded the house completely. There was no way anyone was getting out this time. With the house completely surrounded, the police finally made their entry. No one had been inside that house since Brian and the girls had left 2 weeks prior. They had locked it up tight. When the officers opened the front door, they were met with a bizarre and disturbing scene. Not only was all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place again, but there were pennies glued to the ceiling, hundreds of them just stuck up there. And there was red writing everywhere on all the walls in strange, cryptic messages. The police searched the entire house again, top to bottom. But just like before, they didn't find anyone. They were about to conclude that the person had somehow slipped away again, but one of the officers who was searching the basement noticed something. He saw a small piece of wood that looked like it was covering a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. He found that he could move the appliances aside fairly easily. Behind them was a board. When he pulled the board away, it revealed the entrance to a dark, narrow crawl space. Inside this crawl space, the police made a shocking discovery. Someone had burrowed tunnels through the insulation, creating a hidden network that ran throughout the entire house inside the walls. There were small peepholes drilled into the walls in almost every room, allowing whoever was in there to look out and see everything that was going on. And as they followed this intricate maze of tunnels, they found him. Hiding deep within the walls of the house was Danny LaPlante. It turns out Danny was a teenager who had briefly dated Annie. After they had broken up, he had secretly snuck into their house and had been living in their walls for months. He had been listening to every conversation. He heard them talking about their mother's passing. He watched them through the peepholes as they performed the seance with the Ouija board. And he used all of that information to orchestrate the entire haunting. He was the one tapping on the walls. He was the one writing messages with ketchup. He would sneak out at night when they were asleep or when the house was empty to move the furniture around, and then he would slip back into his hiding spot. After Danny LaPlante was pulled out of the crawl space, he was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention center. But the story doesn't end there. Later, in 1987, after he was released, for reasons that nobody really understands, Danny broke into another family's home. And this time, he murdered almost the entire family in cold blood. The idea of someone living in your walls for months is horrifying enough. But to know that it was a psychopath like Danny LaPlante takes it to another level. That final scene, when the police go in and find the pennies glued to the ceiling and the writing everywhere before finding him in that hidden crawl space, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. It's so bizarre, it almost doesn't seem real. But it was. And you just have to think about the trauma that the Andrews family went through. Not just the loss of their mother, but then this terrifying ordeal and the horrifying realization of what could have happened to them. They were living with a future murderer and they never even knew it. It's a kind of deep-seated trauma that you can only hope they were somehow able to recover from. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. We like to think that we are in complete control of our lives. We make plans, we set goals, and we follow a routine day after day, expecting everything to go exactly the way we want it to. But the truth is, we are all just one random event away from having our entire world turned completely upside down. Sometimes these events are incredibly terrifying. Other times they seem like complete accidents of fate. But every once in a while, something happens that is so wild, so incredibly unlikely, that if you saw it in a movie, you would probably shake your head and say there is no way that could ever happen in real life. Today, I am going to tell you 3 stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them. These are stories of survival, of passion, and of resilience in the face of absolute disaster. These are the kinds of stories that are truly stranger than fiction. These events did not just change their lives in an instant, but in some of these cases, they went on to change the lives of millions of other people all around the world. We will explore how their choices shaped their paths. These stories are a slight departure from what we normally do on this channel, but they still have that same mysterious, gripping feeling that keeps you wondering what is going to happen next. So, if you enjoy these types of narratives, let me know in the comments and we will definitely do more of them. But before we dive into these incredible events, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a straightforward storytelling format, then you have definitely come to the right place, because that is exactly what we do here, and we upload new episodes once a week. If that sounds like something you would enjoy, please go ahead and put glitter inside the like buttons, car vents, so that the very next time they turn on their air conditioning, they get a giant, sparkling surprise blown all over the inside of their car. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly stories. Now, let us get right into today's first story. It was the afternoon of the 9th of July, 2001. A 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen was walking through a dense stretch of woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody was carrying a heavy bag of camping supplies, and his shoulders were starting to ache from the weight. He had come out to these rugged woods for a weekend camping trip with his father and the rest of his local Boy Scout troop. About 30 minutes earlier, Cody had decided to break off from the main group. They were all set up at their primary campsite, but Cody realized they had left some very important gear back in his father's truck. Since the truck was parked a couple of miles away, Cody volunteered to hike back alone to grab the extra supplies. He made it to the truck without any issues, loaded up his bag, and turned right back around to head back to camp. As Cody hiked along the dirt path, he let his mind wander. He was not really paying attention to his surroundings. Instead, he was daydreaming about the campfire that night. He was trying to come up with the perfect spooky story to tell the other scouts to impress them and show them how tough he was. But as he kept walking and thinking, a strange feeling started to creep over him. He stopped walking and looked around. He realized that the trees and the rocks did not look familiar at all. He had been walking for quite a long time, and by his calculations, he should have reached the campsite by now. At first, Cody did not panic. He was a Boy Scout, after all. He told himself that he must have just taken a wrong turn somewhere when he was lost in thought. He figured the smartest thing to do would be to simply retrace his steps, head back to his father's truck, and start the hike over again. That way, he would at least know exactly where he was, even if he ended up being really late getting back to the camp. But as he turned around and started walking, he quickly realized he had no idea which way he had come from. The forest was thick, and because he had not been paying attention, he had drifted far off the main trail. Within minutes, Cody knew he was completely lost, and a cold wave of panic began to settle in his chest. Hours went by. Cody walked frantically through the dense wilderness, desperately calling out for his father or anyone else who might hear him. But the only sound returning to him was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. To make matters worse, as the afternoon started to fade into evening, the sky began to turn a dark, angry purple. Huge storm clouds were rolling over the mountains. Cody knew that a cold night in the Yellowstone wilderness during a storm could easily become life-threatening. But he tried to stay positive. He told himself that his dad and the scout leaders definitely knew he was missing by now. They were probably already setting up a massive search party to find him. But Cody also knew that the wilderness was vast, and it could take them hours or even days to locate him. The thought of spending days out here alone was absolutely terrifying. He took a deep breath, calmed his heart rate down, and decided to rely on his scout training. He needed to build a shelter, find some food and water, and make a fire to keep warm until help arrived. He found a relatively flat spot beneath a tree, sat down, and dumped the contents of his heavy supply bag onto the dirt. But when he looked at what he had brought from the truck, his stomach dropped. None of the items were going to help him survive. There was no gear for building a shelter, no matches to light a fire, no food, and only a tiny bottle of water that was already almost empty. He essentially had nothing. Right at that moment, the sky opened up and a violent thunderstorm began. Cold rain and heavy hail started pounding down through the tree canopy. Lightning flashed and thunder shook the ground beneath his feet. Terrified and freezing, Cody shoved what he could back into his bag, stood up, and just started running blindly through the dark forest, desperate to find any kind of cover. Then, a massive bolt of lightning illuminated the entire area for a split second. In that brief flash, Cody saw the dark opening of a cave right ahead of him. He scrambled over the wet rocks, threw himself inside the cave, and curled up on the hard, dry ground. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, Cody was shivering and crying. He was so overwhelmed by fear and physical exhaustion that his brain simply shut down. He closed his eyes and drifted off into a deep sleep, wondering if he would ever see his family again. The next morning, Cody woke up and crawled to the mouth of the cave. The storm had finally passed, and the sun was beginning to peek through the trees. But before he could even think about what to do next, he heard a faint, distant chopping sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Cody ran out of the cave into a small clearing and looked up. Sure enough, there was a small helicopter flying low over the tree lines, scanning the area. Cody knew he had to act fast before the helicopter flew away. He remembered a trick from his Boy Scout survival manual. He quickly unbuckled his belt, held up the shiny metal buckle, and angled it toward the sun, trying to reflect the bright sunlight directly at the helicopter cockpit. It worked perfectly. The helicopter suddenly tilted, turned in his direction, and began to hover directly above him. The pilot waved through the glass and started looking for a clearing nearby to land the aircraft. Cody was so overwhelmed with joy that he grabbed his bag and ran as fast as he could toward the clearing where the helicopter was descending. He watched as the skids touched down on the grass. Cody did not wait. He ran up to the passenger side, threw the door open, and climbed inside. The pilot turned to him, looked him in the eye, and calmly said, "Good morning." Cody was in such a state of shock and relief that he could barely speak. But when he actually looked at the face of the man who had just saved his life, his jaw dropped. He could not believe who was sitting in the pilot's seat. It turned out that the night before, when Cody did not return, his father had immediately contacted the local authorities. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, and several volunteers from the surrounding area offered to help. One of those volunteers was an amateur helicopter pilot who happened to live nearby and wanted to assist in the search. That pilot had flown 10 miles away from the original campsite to find Cody. And that pilot was none other than Harrison Ford, the legendary actor who played Han Solo in Star Wars and Indiana Jones. When Harrison Ford flew Cody back to the search headquarters and reunited him with his father, his dad assumed Cody would want to go straight home to recover from the trauma. But Cody looked at his dad and said that he wanted to go right back to the Boy Scout camp. He wanted to sit around the campfire and tell the other scouts exactly what had happened to him, because he now had a campfire story that absolutely none of them would ever believe. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes us across the Atlantic Ocean and back in time to September of 1954. A 14-year-old boy named Rich was slowly shuffling his way down the long, sterile hallway of a children's hospital in England. Rich was incredibly weak, and he coughed and wheezed with almost every single step he took. He was walking alongside several other sick children, and they were all heading toward a small classroom located inside the hospital. Rich did not know what kind of lesson they were going to have that day, and honestly, he did not really care. Anything was better than sitting alone in his cramped hospital room, staring at the walls and being bored out of his mind. Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, an infectious lung disease. Over the previous 10 weeks, he had been transferred to several different hospitals as doctors tried to treat his condition. In fact, his illness was so severe that the medical staff had recently sat his parents down and told them that Rich might have to remain hospitalized for up to 2 more years. This was a nightmare for a young boy, but unfortunately, being stuck in a hospital was nothing new to Rich. When he was just 6 years old, his appendix had burst, leading to a massive internal infection that put him into a coma for several weeks. After waking up from the coma, he had to spend nearly an entire year in a hospital bed just to recover from the ordeal. All of these prolonged hospital stays had a devastating impact on Rich's life, especially when it came to his education. He had fallen incredibly far behind in his schoolwork. Because his family was very poor and lived in a tough working-class neighborhood, they could never afford to hire a private tutor to help him catch up. As a result, Rich's entire education consisted of whatever random basic classes the various hospitals happened to offer. Sometimes a teacher would come in to teach them how to weave baskets or maybe how to do basic woodworking. It was not much of an education, but it was all he had. So, on that afternoon in 1954, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he had incredibly low expectations. He assumed it would be another boring activity just to pass the time. But the moment he stepped through the door, his eyes lit up. Sitting at the front of the room was a visiting music teacher, and scattered all around the teacher were various musical instruments. Ever since he was a little boy, Rich had dreamed of playing the drums. He remembered walking past a music store window years ago, staring at a beautiful drum set and wishing more than anything that he could play it. But his family could never afford such a luxury. Now, looking at the instruments in the classroom, Rich realized this might be his only chance. When the teacher started handing out instruments to the children, Rich did not wait. He marched right up and demanded the drum. He told the teacher he would not play anything else. The teacher smiled and handed him a simple snare drum and a pair of wooden sticks. That day, the teacher tried to lead the room of sick children through a few simple songs. The resulting noise was absolutely terrible. None of the kids knew what they were doing, and the music was objectively awful. But to Rich, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. By the time the class ended, he felt completely energized. He had not suddenly become a master drummer in 1 hour, but he had discovered a massive, burning passion for the instrument. He decided right then and there that since he was going to be trapped in this hospital for the foreseeable future, he was going to spend every single second practicing. The very next day, Rich snuck into a hospital utility closet and found some long wooden sticks that the nurses normally used for knitting. Those became his makeshift drumsticks. For the next year and a half, Rich used those knitting needles to beat a rhythm onto every single surface he could find. He drummed on his bedside table, he drummed on the metal radiator, he drummed on his own knees, and he drummed on the floor. Every few weeks, when the music teacher returned to the hospital, Rich would be the first one in the classroom, eager to learn anything he could. In 1955, at the age of 16, Rich was finally released from the hospital. He was completely cured of tuberculosis. But even though he had his health back, his life did not suddenly become easy. His family was still deeply in debt, and Rich could not afford to go back to school. Instead, he had to immediately get a full-time job working in a local factory to help his family pay the bills. Rich did not complain. He knew it was his duty to help his family, and he accepted his reality. But he never let go of his dream. Even while working long, grueling hours at the factory, he would grab pieces of wood and drum on the machinery during his breaks. He found joy in rhythm whenever and wherever he could. Then, on Christmas of 1956, everything changed. Rich's stepfather had secretly been working extra shifts and saving every spare penny he had for months. On Christmas morning, he surprised Rich with a real, actual drum kit of his own. Rich was so emotional he could barely contain himself. It was the greatest gift he had ever received. He began practicing constantly, and before long, he started playing with small local bands in his spare time. He quickly earned a reputation around town as one of the most talented and reliable drummers in the area. A few years later, a highly popular local band had a sudden falling out with their drummer and fired him. They needed a replacement fast, and since Rich was the best drummer around, they approached him and asked if he would join them. Rich immediately accepted. By that point, Rich had started using a stage name, Ringo Starr. And the band that had just hired him to be their new drummer was none other than the Beatles. Our third story takes us to the morning of Sunday, the 20th of October, 1991. A 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their beautiful home in Oakland, California. As soon as Will opened his eyes, he noticed a sharp, pungent smell in the air. It was the smell of wood smoke. Will got out of bed, walked over to the bedroom window and pulled back the curtains. When he looked out toward the horizon, he saw a massive, thick plume of black smoke rising into the sky just beyond the edge of his neighborhood. Because wildfires are a frequent and dangerous reality in California, Will immediately became concerned. He picked up the phone and dialed 911 to report what he was seeing. But the dispatcher told him that the fire department was already all over it. The dispatcher explained that there had been a wildfire on the nearby mountainside about 600 feet away, but it had already been put out. The smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover remains. Relieved, Will went about his normal morning routine. As he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander toward his work. Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on a video game about ants and how they build their homes. He was really excited about this project, designing the virtual colonies in his head as he got dressed. But when Will looked out the window again, his heart stopped. The small plume of smoke had turned into a massive cloud of black soot, and he could see huge orange flames licking up over the trees. The wind had picked up, and the fire was moving directly toward his neighborhood at an incredibly fast speed. Will immediately called 911 again. He could tell from the dispatcher's voice that they were caught off guard and did not realize the fire had flared back up. Will knew he could not wait for help. He grabbed his wife, packed a few bare necessities, and ran out the front door. The street was filled with chaos and thick smoke. Neighbors were frantically loading their cars and preparing to flee. As they were about to speed away, Will suddenly remembered their next-door neighbors. The couple who lived there had gone away for the weekend, leaving their elderly parents to watch after their 2-year-old child. Because the grandparents did not have a car, they were completely trapped. Will ran over, pounded on their door, and helped the terrified grandparents carry the toddler to his car. He stepped on the gas and drove through the blinding smoke to safety. A week later, Will returned to his neighborhood with a police escort. When he got out of the car, he looked at where his house used to be, and it was completely gone. Every house in the neighborhood was leveled. The Oakland Hills firestorm had burned for 4 days, destroying thousands of homes and killing 25 people. Will walked through the rubble of his home. As he stood there surveying the destruction, he was hit with a powerful wave of clarity. He did not care that he had lost all of his possessions. He was just incredibly grateful that his family and his neighbors had survived. As he looked down at the ash at his feet, he noticed a group of ants. Despite the devastating fire, they had survived underground, and they were already busy gathering supplies and rebuilding their colony. This sight gave Will a brilliant idea. He realized that the game he was making should not just be about ants. It should be about how people survive, adapt, and rebuild after tragedies. 9 years later, Will finally released his new video game. But it was not the original game about ants. Instead, inspired by the resilience of those tiny insects in the ruins of his home, he created a game where players could build digital houses, design neighborhoods, and guide characters through simulated lives. But he kept the game realistic by including unpredictable disasters like fires, showing that no matter what happens, you must move forward and rebuild. The game became a massive global success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. All 3 of these incredible stories share a common thread. They show us how fragile our daily lives truly are, and how a single moment can change everything we thought we knew about our future. Whether it is a 13-year-old boy getting lost in the deep wilderness of Yellowstone during a massive storm, or a sick 14-year-old boy facing years of isolation in a hospital bed, or a young software developer watching his entire home turn to ash in a historic firestorm. In each of these situations, it would have been incredibly easy for these individuals to give up. They were facing overwhelming odds, physical danger, and immense emotional pain. But instead of letting despair take over, they kept moving forward, one small step at a time. Cody Clausen relied on his Boy Scout training and kept his calm, leading to a miraculous rescue by one of the most famous Hollywood actors in the world. Richard Starkey found a deep passion for the drums while recovering in a hospital bed, practicing on radiators and tabletops with knitting needles until he eventually became Ringo Starr and joined the most famous rock band in history. And Will Wright watched a resilient colony of ants rebuild in the ruins of his destroyed Oakland home, inspiring him to create a digital universe that would change the entire entertainment industry forever. These stories remind us that life is completely unpredictable, and while we cannot control the disasters that strike us, we can control how we respond to them. The next time you find yourself facing an obstacle that feels completely insurmountable, or a tragedy that seems to tear your world apart, think about these three people. Remember the scout in the cave, the boy with his knitting needles, and the developer watching the ants. They show us that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. We just have to keep moving forward, finding the strength to rebuild, and waiting to see what the next chapter has in store for us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.